right, I'm waiting for the go signal from my tech guy.
Quasi-tech guy. All right.
All right. We're going to go ahead and get our presentation started. Hopefully our tech is working. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this morning and this afternoon. Born in the great state of Pennsylvania, he now serves as a professor at CTSFW, that's Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne. He does lots of speaking. He's been on Issues Etc., and he was the keynote speaker at the CCLE conference last summer. That's the, and I always get the two C's mixed up, Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education. He is the co-host of A Brief History of Power, a weekly podcast. This isn't necessarily their tagline, so you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, that tries to make sense of the present using the past. Very good podcast, and one of the reasons why I wanted to bring Dr. Koontz out to Hamel. He had, I don't know, it was like 4-hour-long episodes on education. And in addition to just speaking about lots of other things that could help us, not only as teachers, but as people of God, moving forward in this kind of weird world. So with that introduction, I'd like to ask you to help me to give a warm welcome to our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Adam Koontz.
Thanks for having me, guys. What we're going to do for about the next hour is go over some historical stuff that'll give us a little bit of a setting for what we're talking about today. We'll also talk about, and these are kind of my headings for this hour, and then the others later on this morning and then in the afternoon. This hour we're going to be talking about love as both ground and motive for Lutheran schools. Then we'll talk about discipline. We're going to give that word maybe a fuller meaning than it often has. In the afternoon, we'll kind of wind down or ease off some of the headier things we're talking about this morning. Going to ask more of your attention this morning. In the afternoon, you know this, as students get tired or antsy, we'll talk about the scope of education, what it was in the early Missouri Synod and what it is for us now, especially in classical schools. And then finally, methods. And this is just going to be sort of interesting, and we'll open up. I know we have time for Q&A after that, but we'll open up for Q&A really at any point throughout the day. I don't mind if you interrupt me. This isn't a big performance by myself or something. So go ahead and raise your hand at any point. But in the afternoon, as we talk about methods, we'll open up for discussion because the comparison of some of the methods that were historically used with what we do and where they are the same, why they might have different purposes now than they did then, all of that I think will be interesting to you. So we're going to start with kind of more theoretical things and work into more practical things in the afternoon. For about the next hour, I want to talk about love as ground and motive, but I want to start by explaining where I'm getting some of this, not all of it. So this is not just a purely historical presentation about the way things used to be or used to be done. But some of what I'm getting, and a lot of it, especially in the afternoon, are from two men, one of whom is kind of the father of Lutheran education in the Missouri Synod, and one of whom is very influential sort of later on. Okay? The first of those is a guy named J.C.W. Lindemann. He dies in the mid-1870s, so that's pretty early in the whole scheme of things. He doesn't make it to the 30th anniversary of the Missouri Synod, right? So 1876, if I remember correctly. In 1872, he writes a book called Evangelical Lutheran School Praxis, right? Praxis. So basically it's a manual for how to be a teacher, how to run a school, including mundane details, when you should let them outside, things like that. That's all in there, but also a lot of theological points, and that's what we'll be talking about especially in this hour. Evangelical Lutheran School Praxis. That seems to be the textbook at both what is then the Addison Teachers Seminary in Addison, Illinois, later to be Concordia River Forest, okay, and now Concordia Chicago, as well as, by the time it's founded in the 1890s, at the Teachers College in Seward, Nebraska, now Concordia University, Nebraska. He's the textbook. It's in German. It's never made it into any other language, right, including English. So this doesn't get translated. And that's going to be significant because, like a lot of other things, especially in our own churches, just our church's specific heritage, when things get locked into what are now to us foreign languages, they also just get forgotten, dropped. I mean, almost more than forgotten if I never knew it existed, right? To forget my keys at home is to mean that I once had them and I knew that they were there and what they do. We don't even know that he's there, right? This got stuffed into, the insulation by a previous occupant of the house, and we don't even know that it's there, okay? So that's Lindemann. His work, this school praxis book, is really extensive. So it covers both what's going to be called pedagogy in English, so German is very different from English in that it's just got a smaller vocabulary, so the words are more obviously related to each other. And so if I had to turn it into English, that it's going to be awkward but makes sense, he talks about this as raising up. So there's a whole section on raising up. They don't use this word pedagogy, they don't have fancy words, it's raising up. How do we raise up in a school? But in addition to that, there's what kind of curricula are we going to have? And that's kind of spelled out along with lists of books. Who is the teacher? How do we think about the teacher's call? Okay, both specifically in the church, but also maybe more generally, what do you get up in the morning and think that you're doing in the school? That's all in there. A much more limited book that is, however, somehow supposed to replace that book is from 1930 by a guy named E.W.A. Keeler, Koehler. He had, maybe that name is familiar to you, he wrote a book called Summary of Christian Doctrine that is sometimes used and I think was intended for kind of higher levels of Lutheran school in order to give a basic knowledge of Christian theology to maybe like high school students or even college students. He also wrote an explanation to the Small Catechism that still, I believe the print shop at Fort Wayne still prints that book. So he wrote a variety of things. He also, like Lindemann, taught at what is now Concordia University, Chicago, right? So in 1930, he writes a book called Christian Pedagogy. He says this is supposed to replace, he mentions Lindemann by name, this is supposed to replace Lindemann, but the thing is, not only is it a lot smaller and kind of a different book for reasons that are understandable and we can discuss later, it really just covers the specific to the discussion of education pedagogical questions, such as what are children? Like, what am I dealing with when I'm dealing with a child, right? Things that if you were in a modern educational college would get filed under maybe child development or child psychology or something. And some of it is very traditional, recognizable from Lindemann, but it doesn't really tell you what is a Lutheran school for, what is a Lutheran teacher, why do we have Lutheran schools, how do we run them. There's no list of curricula, such as you find in Lindemann. That's because there are all these other books, none of which we really have anymore, okay? So one thing to notice is that over time, our thinking about what we're doing in a Lutheran school gets really fragmented. And that's because of just kind of a general historical thing, and this will set us up for the discussion of love, okay? In Lindemann's time, in the 1800s, still in the 19th century, your average Lutheran school is kind of an unusual place in the sense that it's generally taught by a man. It's pretty unusual in American education, even in the 19th century, right? Think about the descriptions of schools maybe in like Little House on the Prairie, right? That school is usually taught by a woman. Teaching is already generally a female profession, okay, even in the 19th century. Lutheran schools are different, okay? There are 3 different institutions where a teacher could be trained in the Missouri Synod by the end of the 19th century. At the beginning, they get trained at the Fort Wayne Seminary, which is still in Fort Wayne when it gets started, and they're trained right alongside pastors. Then there's Addison, later River Forest, now Chicago. and then eventually there's Seward, Nebraska. At each of those places, they get trained, and they're going to get a call and go out, and they're probably going to be, and you have pictures right here of these men. There's generally one. There's one pastor and one teacher. And that actually means you're a pretty big church, okay? That the teacher is somebody different than the pastor, because in roughly half of Missouri Synod schools, the teacher and the pastor are the same person. And not at St. Louis, but at first Fort Wayne and then later Springfield Seminary, they were all trained to do things like teach science, because they just assumed that their graduates would be teaching. So it's kind of the Missouri Synod is very unusual in this way, in teaching being a mainly male profession. And that's conveyed by a variety of things. The teacher has a call. The teacher is called by Lindemann a servant of the word. That's a title pastors also have. And he also has a title. He's called teacher. He's not called Mr. or she is not called Miss or Mrs. It's teacher, last name, just like pastor, last name. So it's kind of an unusual, Missouri Synod's unusual educationally in that. By Kaler's time, 1930s, this is no longer true. Okay? The Missouri Synod still has vastly more men teaching than even the Roman Catholic Church, certainly than in public schools. And just, this is kind of a side note. When I think of American public schools historically, I kind of think of them as non-denominational Protestant schools. If you look at what they actually do religiously, historically, and I grew up in a small town, small enough that we still did things like this, like we had prayers, and we had this thing called church school that we would walk across the street to, and we would like learn the 10, so I didn't grow up in church, but we learned the 10 Commandments, we learned the books of the Bible, we learned all this stuff, and nobody objected to this. And it was functionally non-denominational Protestant, right? That's what your average public, and go, again, go look at Little House on the Prairie for a reflection of this, right? What are they doing? They read the Bible. They don't say you should baptize babies or not baptize babies. There's no particular catechism involved. They read the Bible, they pray, maybe they pray the Lord's Prayer, maybe they learn the Protestant version of the 10 Commandments. It's kind of a non-denominational Protestant school. That's what public schools are, I'm saying functionally, historically in America. So there's that. There's Catholic schools. Catholic schools are largely taught by nuns who basically are just fed and clothed, and that's about it. But that's how they staff most of these schools. Lutheran schools are still pretty unusual, even down to the 1930s. But Kaler is not specific about who's teaching, whether this person does or doesn't have a divine call or a certificate of vocation. A lot of that stuff is just, and I'm just speaking historically at this point, he just kind of leaves up for determination. Okay? In addition to his book, there's a bunch of other small books called the Concordia Teacher's Library, which you probably have somewhere around here if you dig. And if you don't, I'm sorry you got rid of them at some point, because they're very interesting books, but they're old now, no longer available. A lot of the volumes are written by a man named P.E. Kretzmann, who's very important at this point for teaching education. He teaches at the St. Louis Seminary eventually. He's kind of suspicious for having a doctorate at that time. That's because it's from outside the Synod. So, the past is not always golden. They were just suspicious because it wasn't us. So he had a doctorate in education, so he's pretty influential. The reason I set all this up is to give you a little bit of a sense of historical perspective, but also to give you a sense that this is an ongoing conversation in which your school here is an enduring historical example of these people who cared enough to educate their own children in ways distinctive, both in the 1870s and in the 1930s and in the 2020s. Okay? So there's a sense in which I have no need to teach you, or I can't even teach you anything today, because your school here specifically has continued these things over time. Now, at a certain point, you can see over there in the historical display to my right, you can see the title change from teacher last name to Mr. last name. And that does mark certain things, okay? Marks some of these changes I just mentioned, but you've had this the whole time, right? And so what we're saying is, just to begin, is that you are inheritors of something, but also have a responsibility to pass it on. You're heirs of something, but you're also those who will bequeath something to your children and grandchildren, the children and grandchildren of the parish, right? You're in a very long line. And it's that sense of continuity that I want to stress just to start today. Because that means that not only can the past probably tell us something, but it means this too, not just that we have inherited something from the past, but that what we can see witness to in the past is love. Okay? Because you have to ask yourself, why would these people go to these lengths, produce all their own books, okay? Because generally the book recommendations, when and where they exist, are either, especially in the German language, they're either printed in St. Louis, or they have to ship them from Germany to get them here, okay? So you can't just walk into any, they're actually not okay with stuff that people like myself now love and are nostalgic for, like McGuffey's readers. They don't like McGuffey's readers, okay? They have all their own books, okay? And they either print them at their own cost or they ship them here. And some of this is, understandable, and some of it is very culturally foreign to us. But what it does evidence is that they desire the children to know Jesus Christ. They desire the children to know how to be useful citizens in this country. Most of all, they really desire the children to obtain heaven. There's a couple of things that are going to follow from that you do find in continuity really throughout the history of our Synod's discussion of education, close to the present time. And most of this I'm getting out of Lindemann because other reading that I've done either echoes these things or assumes these things. And assuming is generally bad. One of the things that's assumed is that worship is actually central to the Lutheran school. Okay. And that means that the Lutheran school is, first of all, the place where both the teacher and the child will know the love of God in Jesus Christ. First of all, that means that the Lutheran school is grounded upon the love that God has displayed for mankind in Jesus Christ. And I know that that sounds passé or obvious, and that's sort of the problem, if it sounds passé or obvious to us, or if we just sort of assume that, right? So why would I go to the length of building a building and then paying for it and making sure that we have teachers adequately instructed in order to all of them convey these things to the children? Why would I do that, first of all? It's because I hear things like what we heard in church this morning, right? I hear that God doesn't stand far off from us, right? He doesn't sort of observe us from a distance and hope that things work out, as parents sometimes do when their children are sent off to this or that educational institution. I hope it works out. Someone else is going to teach them, and I hope that it works out. He doesn't stand far away from us, right? He draws very near to us, right? So he becomes so near to us that he becomes one of us, so that he can be with us, both in his earthly ministry, and then in the sacraments, most of all, the sacrament of the altar, so that he can, he says, be with us always, even to the end of the age. So there's this dwelling that God desires to have with man that indicates that I cannot, therefore, when I look at someone in Jesus Christ, I can't stand far off and say, well, I hope it works out. Especially with a question like education, which is so central to who the person becomes, not just in the way he makes money, or if we want to say it less crassly, maybe his calling, but who he is, how his soul is shaped or misshapen by what he learns. So it's this love of God that draws near to us in Jesus Christ that then is the ground for the love that both the parents and the congregation have for the child. So there's kind of two sources of where the school comes from. Okay, and this is an interesting thing, and this actually we'll get into if you you want to talk about the rather convoluted history of Lutheran teachers and calls and the definition of the ministry, we can do that today. I'm not sure it's entirely germane, okay? But I'm happy to do it. It's interesting to me. I just don't think it's the most absolutely important thing to be discussed today. But Lindemann says the Lutheran school has two sources. One is a natural source. That is, any parent should care about what his child learns, right? Lindemann doesn't, because it's really pretty historically rare in American education until the 20th century. Lindemann says, I guess you could have children taught at home, but that's really the preserve of the wealthy. Okay? Partly because the home is a place of so much work, I mean physical work, that it's really not imaginable to anybody in the 19th century that mom is going to teach, or even dad is going to teach, any amount of school at home. That's just not really envisioned, except for the wealthy. So when Lindemann does mention what we would call homeschooling, he mentions it as maybe you could hire a teacher and he could be brought into the home, okay? And with just an absolute explosion in homeschooling since 2020, there are things like that beginning to happen, okay? But again, that is still generally the preserve of the wealthy, right? Your average person is simply working too much to wash and clean and bake and cook. She's not going to be like, okay, let's do algebra now, right? That's simply not happening. So there's just kind of hard limits on that. So the vision here is that generally there's going to be a school. He says, therefore, we do not despise the public schools, right? So there isn't really an antagonism. There's simply the recognition that the natural motive to see your child trained is not enough for a Lutheran school to exist. On the parent's part, there has to be in him the knowledge of Jesus Christ, that he would think to himself, this is the most important thing my child could possibly learn, therefore I need an education that is centered on that, right? So the parent has to have this kind of holy dissatisfaction with a purely natural reason for educating his child. He must care most about his child's obtaining heaven through the knowledge of Jesus Christ. That's the basic ground for the parent to want a Lutheran schooling. Okay? So he says, in that sense, that would be enough, right? And the parents of the congregation, just the people with school-age children, could get together and say, we're going to have a school on that basis. But he says, that would be a neglect, and in this sense, and Lindemann, who is both a school teacher and an ordained minister, okay, which is going to be generally the case for the presidents of, what becomes Concordia Chicago, both teaching experience with ordination. So he's done both. So he says on the pastor's part, it would be very, very strange if he could look at any child who needs to be educated and say, I hope that works out. And he continually refers to this admonition that Jesus gives to Peter after his resurrection, feed my lambs. So he sees that as given directly to the ministers, okay, with Peter as sort of their representative in this case, feed my lambs. And if the pastor can look with indifference at the children and say, it's okay, you can just go wherever, or go somewhere that you're going to learn business skills but nothing about Christ, then he is neglecting his office. Okay, so he sees the school as an outgrowth of, in this sense, two loves. One is the Christian parent's love. One is the Christian pastor's love, with the duties that come with love. Okay. So out of those loves flow obvious duties. Well, now I have to do something about this. This is why when he's thinking about why a school exists or who's in charge of a school, he says the school does not belong to synod, That's kind of an obvious Missouri Synod talking point, right? We don't have to listen to Synod, right? I say that with, whoever's watching and with Pastor Paul in the room, but we all know this is true, right? It doesn't belong to Synod. But also, the school is not the preserve only of those with children in it, because even if I don't have any children, or my children are grown up and long gone from my home, I still, as a Christian, love the children who are in the congregation and want them to know Jesus Christ. So that the school's existence is not because somebody particularly wanted it. It's because of understanding the love of Jesus Christ. I would have the children know Jesus Christ above all things. That's why. So it's the entire congregation's concern. It's not just the concern, although it is obviously of parents or pastors or teachers. So he's going to see the teacher as working alongside the pastor, right? Because part of what the teacher is doing is helping the pastor fulfill his ministry. Okay. And he's going to see the teacher as working alongside the parents, helping the parents fulfill their duties of love to the children. Okay. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions or thoughts so far? Anybody? Everybody's good? Yeah, go ahead.
You said the school has
or specifically Christian.
Okay.
Yeah. And those are those duties of love that we discussed. Yeah. Anything else so far? So that's going to be the ground, the foundation, the basis, the fundament for why there are Lutheran schools. And when you think about it that way, and you think about the fact that this man is training at that time in his lifetime basically all of your trained teachers in the Synod, then you understand how and why the Missouri Synod is so unusual in the density of Lutheran schools. Meaning, there are Lutheran schools in other Lutheran church bodies. They're just far rarer. Far rarer. Okay? And some of that has to do with culture. The Germans have a much stronger sense of passing on their own culture than even Norwegians that we are in full communion with who train at the same seminaries. So that's different. But part of it is also a theological motivation that the Missouri Synod has more schools than the Wisconsin Synod, right? Which now sounds maybe a little paradoxical because they are definitely more insular than we are at this point. And we're not even necessarily insular. We spread throughout pretty much any major city in the United States. We have churches. We have, at one time, a teacher training institution in New Orleans, which very few people remember ever existed. So it's not really a question of staying put necessarily, or of what is traditional, because this is really the first generation of our schools. It is the sense that if there is a church, there is at least one school. Now, I learned yesterday that your congregation has a history similar to many congregations, where there was really the school board of the congregation would have been more like a school district board, because the church would start multiple schools. Okay. Now, this is the closest that we get to an idea that I find all over the place now when Lutherans talk about education, which is that somehow the Lutheran school relates to the extension of the kingdom of God. That's kind of the old word, extension, what we would now call church planting, right? So Lutheran Church Extension Fund is kind of an old planting word. That's extension used to be used for that. And I hear often that Lutheran schools can be missionary agencies. That is, we bring the kids in and then they are taught. This is also one of the defenses of the Concordia system, that they're going to be brought to a Lutheran university or a Lutheran elementary school or a Lutheran high school, and there they will learn the truth of God. I'd have to say this is not exactly how this works early on. The way that this works early on is that the missionary work of the church is assumed to be going on. You'll notice this if you look at really boring things like old convention reports. Okay, very boring. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize it for you, so you don't have to be the sad display of humanity that I am. That is, you'll notice that there are lists, right? So the list will always be congregations, pastors. The number of pastors is pretty much always, because we're doing the right thing, fewer than the number of congregations. Not because we're shrinking, but because we're growing, okay? And then you'll have a list of schools. And generally, especially in the Midwest, the number of schools will track with or even exceed the number of congregations. How does this work? It's assumed that part of the pastor's job is to find people and then to gather them into groups. Those groups could be, first of all, some kind of church, or they could be, first of all, some kind of school. And you say, well, they were all Germans. Well, you still had to do work. It's not as if the farmer was sitting there plowing his, he's sitting there and he just got done plowing and he thinks to himself, I want my children to read Virgil in Latin, right? Or he thinks to himself, I really wish that somebody with a university education, like a Missouri Synod pastor, could teach my kid how to read and write. All organizing people into coherent groups where they're going to learn about Jesus Christ, whether during the weekday in a school or on Sundays in the church, it all takes work. Did they understand their target audience was people of relatively recent immigration in a certain language? Sure they did. But if you just think about it in that basic way, people that know the same language and sort of live in the area, we have the same opportunity, we actually have more. Because we're not limited in belonging to a particular immigrant community at this point. All of that takes work to organize those people and to say, you need to bring your children. Okay. So we want to look at love as not only the ground, the love of God in Jesus Christ, but also the motive, the thing pushing us to have Lutheran schools and to keep them up and to extend them. That is, to have more of them. So they are a missionary agency, but not in the sense that we say, we'll take your tuition dollars or we'll take the state's voucher dollars, and that will help us, and hopefully in exchange you learn Jesus Christ. It's a whole package. That is, if you're going to be in the school, then you will be a member of the Lutheran Church either now or later, and your family will be. This is an all-encompassing life. That's why the school is there. That's why we pay for the school. That's why we have the teacher and the teacherage and all this other stuff that would look to other denominations or most Americans involved in American public schools like duplication of effort or much extra cost or something. Why do we have these things? It's out of love. That's what's going to push us to say, okay, we have one congregation here, let's get another one over here. We have one school here, let's get another one in the village, right? It's not only grounding us. Why do we do this? The love of God in Jesus Christ. But it's also pushing us outward. Right? And you will notice something if you are unfortunate enough to look at these old reports that the Missouri Synod, with its schools, the schools not lagging, right, the way they do today, where it's like we have, I don't know how many thousand congregations, and how many schools do we have? Okay, and we don't really, it would be helpful to measure homeschoolers, but still, I don't think that would end up with a number where the homeschoolers plus the Lutheran schools would equal the number of congregations. Or that the homeschoolers plus the Lutheran schoolers would cover, an enormous percentage of most of our congregations, right? So how many people are getting a Lutheran education? There's a big lag today. For them, there's no lag. Why? Think about what we said earlier with the notion of this coming out of feed my lambs. The school is a holistic part of the church doing its job. It's a holistic part of the Christian parent doing his job to raise his children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And it's a holistic part of the congregation with its pastor doing their job to care for the souls of those under their charge. So it's not really separate, it's also not really, therefore, optional. Right? So it's presumed that if you're a member of a Missouri Synod congregation, there is a school for you to send your children to, and your children do go to that school. I think that this sounds, so I'll just throw the boogeyman word out there and then we'll discuss why this is not the case. The word legalism, and I understand that and I get how that can occur. Look at the Pharisees as a display of the source and then also the fruits of legalism, if we mean anything really actually concrete by that word. Here's why I don't think that the way that we handled Lutheran schools was legalistic. One is that the basis for our action was not control over people. Think about how the Pharisees behave. They don't really do the things that they ask other people to do, but they do ask other people to do lots of things, right? You bind burdens you yourselves know are too heavy to bear, right? That's what the Pharisees do. And so they always have to, that's how they wind up pretending to be something they're not, right? Because they're teaching and what they actually do doesn't line up. They also are not teaching God's word. They are teaching what Jesus calls, right, traditions of men. Traditions of men. Treating it as if it is the doctrine of God. Okay? And this is really, I think, a caricature about our own history that we were like this. If you can read Lindemann, you get a hold of this book and you can read it, and I would love for somebody to translate it. He is a very lively, engaging person. And he talks a lot about, for instance, the need for the teacher to be lively and what we would call engaging, and he says friendly, right? So it's not this sort of caricature of forbidding and you will do what we say, and this is the way that we will handle people, and they will do exactly what we say, and then they will grow up and they'll give money to the church, right? It's not the same system of command, control, obedience, and then hypocrisy that you get with the Pharisees. So I do not think it is legalism. I think it is something else that is clear from the New Testament, which is that there are always, in every congregation, practical expectations for membership, okay, that people need to abide by. Let me give you a New Testament example, and then we'll kind of spell this out with Lutheran schools. New Testament example is that a rumor goes around in Thessalonica that people are not working because they're saying that the resurrection has already occurred. You know this. This is in 2 Thessalonians that this gets going, and they already have problems with this in 1 Thessalonians, right? Shocker, right? Congregations will have roughly the same problem for years and years, even when it's been dealt with, and they'll have to work through it, and it'll take time, and so on. So however far apart 1 and 2 Thessalonians are, they're still confused about the resurrection. So by 2 Thessalonians, there are grown men who refuse to work. Okay. And, Paul will say things that, again, sound harsh. We'll talk about the role of discipline in the next hour. But he says, let he who does not work shall not eat. Okay. Why? Because he needs to understand the consequences of not living up to the fact that we're all sacrificing for each other. We are, in words from a different epistle, we are bearing one another's burdens. Okay? So if we have, let's say in a sample congregation, let's say we have 12 families, right? And that's going to be the source of our school, right? Their children. Now let's just imagine 2 out of those 12 families don't go along with that. It's not that I'm saying that your child will definitely go to hell if he doesn't go to the Lutheran school. That's the caricature of this, right? What I'm saying is, we're doing something together. You need to do that with us so that what we're doing and the fact that we're doing it and the burdens we bear because of it will actually be done together as a congregation, as the subset of the congregation that have children in the school, because once one of us starts to opt out from these practical life things, then all of us will think, well, it's just optional, I'll do whatever I want. And now we're really living our lives Monday through Saturday apart from each other. Practically. Very practically, we are apart from each other. And I guess we can carry on that way for a certain amount of time, but eventually our school will obviously close because our lives are not really centered on the parish, on the church and its school. Our school will obviously close, and at that point, now it's so much harder to provide for what I know I need to provide for my child to know, which we'll talk about especially what was that when we talk about scope in the afternoon. Right? So the practical understanding, and there are different cases, and this gets parsed out differently in different places, and the English district, of which for the next 2 months I'm still a member, never goes along with this, is never really that helpful about having Lutheran schools. In fact, if you look deeply at the history of many of our English district congregations, you'll find out that they were founded by often wealthier members who wanted their kids to go to the English-speaking school, the public school, so that they could integrate with the social class that the parents belonged to. Okay. So it's not like this. I'm not saying like any of this ever worked perfectly. I'm saying they had reasons for doing the things that they were doing, and I think that they were not only understandable, but often more deeply Christian than the reasons that we had for abandoning these practices, right? That they were driven by a certain understanding of what they intended for their child, which was much deeper than something that very interestingly Lindemann, writing in 1872, mentions. He says, "It is characteristic of our American youth," 1872, "it is characteristic of our American youth to devote themselves too much to the obtaining of, quote, a good job." 1872. Now, if you go, and there are really kind of fun things that you can find on the internet. I did this in doing some of the stuff that Mr. Girth mentioned for the series we did on Brief History of Power about American education. We did 2 on public education, 2 on private generally, including homeschooling, and then 2 on Lutheran education. Is that if you go and you try to take, say, like a high school admission exam, right? Because high school isn't normal in the 1870s, right? Most people end their education at 8th grade, right? And that's still common in some of our rural communities down to the 40s and the 50s, 1940s, 1950s. If you take a high school admission exam, so there's a high school from the Northeast, so really good, it's still a good high school, Central High School in Philadelphia, and you take their admission exam from, say, 1880, I mean, I don't know if I could pass it. I don't know if I could get in to the high school, right? So here's what they're expecting of kind of a 14-year-old boy. Here's some Latin, translate that, do this complex math. This is kind of normal. So that's the quality of education sort of generally. It's really pretty good. But at that same time, J.C.W. Lindemann is saying, people are too focused on getting a good job. They think that's why you're being educated. And I think that basic understanding of education is always going to be, it's going to be really difficult to make this case grounded and motivated by love for Lutheran schools, whether parish school, homeschool, whatever. It's going to be hard to make that case if people understand, maybe on a deep level, that maybe we're not addressing when we talk about it to them individually, or if we talk about education in a sermon or a presentation at a voters meeting or something. If they sort of, in their heart of hearts, believe that education is essentially vocational, then the case for schooling even, let alone Lutheran schooling, let alone please make this sacrifice so that we can continue to have our parish school, it's never quite going to ring true to people. If they're assuming that education is basically vocational, that it's all ultimately a means to an end. So, for example, let's say that I really stress, there are some public schools like this, there are private schools that I know of, I really stress public speaking. Okay, really, really stress it. There are ways to teach public speaking such that it's of benefit for the church. You say, okay, well, we're gonna teach public speaking. We have a pre-seminary requirement at both our seminaries that they have to know some public speaking before they get there. There's also ways to think about public speaking that it's just, why don't you learn public speaking so that you can maintain control over other people, right? Sort of a pure sophistry. That's what the sophists in the ancient world do, right? They'll teach you anything for money, and the reason they'll do that is because they look at what they're teaching you not as something that is changing your soul. It's just a series of techniques that you need to learn so that you can make more money or have more power than you did before you learned them. So this is an ancient problem. It's not new. It's not even new in America. Right? So if you think people might be, maybe they're shallow, or maybe they don't really think very much about why their children are going to school or what they're learning in school, I'm not sure it's not a new problem. It's not even a very new problem. Because Lindemann is complaining about it all the way back then. Another thing to just sort of note about, difficulties, right? So one difficulty in opposition to love would be, well, I thought education was just to get a job. Another difficulty in opposition to love is the rise in complexity of education. So this is my observation. This is neither Lindemann nor Kaler's. Because even Kaler, writing in 1930, Christian Pedagogy, predates the kind of consolidation, especially in rural areas, even of public education, that makes things like homeschooling or one-room schooling legally very difficult, depending on where you are. So what happens is that you get a sharp rise in the complexity of what it takes to have a school. A similar rise in complexity for having a pastor would be the cost of insurance or housing, right, rising over that time, making it more and more difficult for congregations to have them. This happens first to schools, right? Because unfortunately, it seems, this is my observation, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but it's my observation that when a congregation is faced with, especially a cost challenge, the first thing to go is the Monday through Saturday Christian stuff that will be sacrificed in order to retain, and this makes basic sense, but it's sad nonetheless, in order to retain the functioning of the Sunday things. So your average congregant is not going to see the pastor much. He'll certainly see him on Sundays. We have to keep that. That makes basic sense. That is the heart and soul of the congregation's existence, is divine service. Unfortunately, people don't therefore make the connection between what happens then and then what happens in the school Monday through Friday. So because they don't see Sunday flowing into the rest of the week, when there is some kind of sacrifice that might need to happen, some kind of hardship that might have to be endured or borne, the stuff Monday through Friday is the first stuff to go, generally speaking. So, there are plenty of congregations, certainly I've been to a number of them, in the rural Midwest where there's this enormous building. And why is there this enormous building for a congregation of 40 people? It's because 40 years ago they had a school, right? That they haven't knocked down for whatever reason, right? So the thing there is not that there are no more children, right? The number might be smaller in that parish, certainly, but that what has really happened is that Monday through Friday are now left up to very different agents of education, of information, of shaping, of the crafting of the children's souls, left up to very different agents than they were 40 years ago when they were still at school. Right? So we've got kind of this vocational focus on education that makes love hard for people to understand. Why would you do this? Why would you sacrifice? Why would you have these expectations for members? There's also the disconnect between what occurs on Sunday what Sunday is a foretaste, how that is a foretaste of heaven, how that is the goal of the congregation gathered around the altar on Sunday. There's a disconnect between what's happening then and there and what is happening Monday through Friday, especially for the lambs.
Could you,
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you explain what you mean by vocation? Are you specifically looking at getting a job, that type of thing?
Yeah.
Or vocation as being,
Yeah.
I am a father, and that is
Right.
vocation, that's my station in life. Are you
Yeah.
making a distinction?
Yeah, vocational in the sense that we use it like in education.
Okay.
So, vocational technical school, right? Because I think the only way that you can think that's really what education is for is if you neglect vocation in the sense that we usually talk about it in the Lutheran Church, which is my goal in life is not to have a certain, amount on my W-2 by the time I retire, right? It's to be a father, it's to be a mother, it's, right? Those are things that God has given me independent of my income, independent of my degrees, independent of whatever it is that I use to make money. And those are actually also going to be of much more lasting value and worth. My vocations, right? The fact that I am a member of a congregation. These kinds of, the way that I think about this, both for what schools do, but also, I say this to congregants, I say this to students at the seminary, is you really need, if you want to understand what it is that you're supposed to be doing in life, think about the things that people do or don't ask for on their deathbed. And no one ever asks to be surrounded or mourns the fact that he is not surrounded by his impressive, income statements, by the performance of his 401k in a certain decade, or a lot of the other things that people spend a lot of time and also education trying to obtain, right? It's, I want to see my children, I want the pastor to come. It is extremely clarifying for what education is supposed to be, because what I'm really shaping finally is what is the person actually aiming his life toward. And the one who has aimed his life toward the getting of money especially, right? And so Luther has this kind of throwaway, it's sort of a throwaway remark. This is Luther's way, right? Is to insightful observation, moving on, insults the Pope, monks are bad. Another insightful observation, that's kind of his rhythm, right? Insightful observation in the large catechism is that Mammon is the most common god beside the true God, right? So he's the most common competitor to the true gods. That's why this, going to school is just for getting a good job. That's why this isn't a new problem at all. But it's one of the saddest misunderstandings, because one kind of schooling is actually oriented toward helping you appreciate, even when you're 19 years old, to some degree, what you will still appreciate and love rightfully when you're 89 and dying. And another kind of schooling is setting you up to be very ambitious and energetic when you're 19, but you're going to realize it's worthless maybe by the time you're 29, let alone 89. Like it doesn't matter. And you have the job, you have the money, and still your life is hollow. So this understanding of what we're oriented toward is, if that can be grasped, then it is much, much, much easier to ask people, either with their children or with their time or with their money or whatever else it is that they have, to give to the existence, to the maintenance of the school. Right? If they haven't grasped that themselves, even if they do send their children to the school, it's much harder to ask of the parents, of the children, of the parish, because they're sort of thinking on some deeper level than their behavior, revealed by other behaviors they have. They're still sort of thinking that life is about, the obtaining of stuff that you're still going to be building units the day you die to put more stuff into, right? And there's something delusional about that has to be uncovered now, right, before it's too late for that person, that family, that parish. Yeah, good question. Other questions while we have a little bit of time? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
I know you said that Lutheran said this in 1872,
Mhm.
but it seems to me, I'm not a real strong student of history, but that there was the family, that there was apprenticeships. The school wasn't there necessarily to prepare them for their future work,
Yeah.
because they might follow in the family farm, or they might apprentice, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Mhm.
There was a huge paradigm shift somewhere, apparently starting back then,
Mhm.
where it really was, schooling was for their future, to provide their family.
Yeah, that's good.
Instead of just coming through and doing what their family had done before.
That's right, yeah. And you can see the germ of some of these things. It's not nearly as widespread as it is today, where the person is on his second graduate degree, deeper in debt, in order to get a certain kind of a job. There is not nearly as much, we're still gonna have presidents, who are high school dropouts for many years after 1872, because it doesn't matter. What you accomplish is your resume, not how many or whence your degrees come, right? So, so it is very different. And interestingly, in that world, which actually sort of values credentials less than ours does, specifically what we would now call classical schooling is much more commonly accepted, right? So it's not, they're not fighting, right? So if you say, oh, well, my kid learns Latin at school, let's be honest, my kids, we homeschool, my kids learn Latin too, but let's be honest, that's weird, right? It's weird. It's great, but it's weird, right? Because what's much more common now is a very different orientation in education. At this time, when education is not nearly so career focused, I don't know how many tests I took in public school to find out what kind of career I was supposed to have, right? And we even had, rural schools, so I guess we were good potential cannon fodder. We all had Army recruiters come in and give us the Army vocational aptitude battery, and then you get calls from recruiters for the next decade type of thing, because they're training us for a job, right? But in 1872, that's not nearly as common. It's not nearly as common, partly because most folks, you're right, are going to go into what their father does or what their mother does, and those options are fairly limited, but life is not so much about choices as it is for us. And if they don't do that, then then it's just presumed, and education means, here's this paragraph of Latin translated. Tell me something about Herodotus, type of thing to get into high school, let alone college. So that's a very good point. Yep. Other questions or comments right now? We have a little bit of time. It's up to you guys. All right, so let me sum up a little bit and then set us up for the next hour. We'll take a 15-minute break and come back at 11:30 after this. So let me set us up for that. Is that in the next hour when we talk about discipline, I do want to talk about that in the common sense that it has in English, which is the discipline of a classroom, or classroom management, I guess is kind of our more modern neutral term, but it's all the same stuff that they were talking about under the idea of discipline. But also in the sense that the English word discipline is related to another English word, disciple. Disciple. And that what the school is there to do, right, what is love actually trying to carry out Monday through Friday, is to produce disciples of Jesus Christ. And that discipling, right, that discipline in and under Jesus Christ, is going to have a certain shape. So we'll talk about what that shape is for, respectively, the classroom, right? What is this like? How are they thinking about this? Okay. How does the classroom need to be? Okay. And this is not, not all of this is going to be entirely like, yes, this is exactly what we need to be doing. Like, let's go back. Like, let's get in our horse and buggies and run all our schools in exactly this way. But what were their classrooms like? Okay. In addition to that, what kind of discipline is supposed to be inculcated in the child? And there's going to be kind of a formula for how both Lindemann and Kaler talk about the child and his nature. And then finally, what kind of discipline is the teacher's self-discipline, right? So what is the teacher working on in himself for Lindemann, or himself or herself for Kaler, that is going to be necessary to doing the job well, right? Not for being stagnant, right? Not for just kind of, okay, I've done this 27 times, I guess I'll do it a 28th time, but continuing yourself also to grow, because the discipling is not just of the student, it's also, and you know this if you teach, and especially if you love teaching, it's also of the teacher. Yeah, you are changed in Jesus Christ as you teach, right? So we'll talk about that. That'll set us up for some of the more nitty-gritty stuff we'll do in the afternoon, which will be fun. How did they teach handwriting? Why did they teach handwriting? They had to teach 2 different kinds of cursive, because German has a different kind of English. So just kind of fun stuff in the afternoon, but we'll do a little bit more heavy stuff. Take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back. All right, folks, let's get started here. And in this session, we're going to run. I'm going to follow the original time amount, just not the time slot. I didn't have any control over when the station went on the air, but I will keep the program as long as it was originally intended to be. So we're going to go to 12:15, and then we'll break for lunch at that point. So just 45 minutes on this. And in talking about discipline, let's talk just a little bit about word origin to start with, which is sometimes a fun exercise for our students. It's especially fruitful with Latin and Greek to find these things for our kids, so they can understand at least some of the words whose spelling makes sense in English. Teaching reading English is maybe the hardest thing we've done in the homeschool, just because English doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But sometimes words that at least come from a Romance language make a little bit of sense. Discipline is one of those. We mentioned this before we took a break, but I want to keep these ideas more related to each other than they usually are, discipline and disciple, because I think that the role of discipline, in the sense that we usually mean it in English, is often maybe underestimated in making disciples, right? Which is the task that Jesus has given to the church, making disciples. Because discipline is thought of maybe in a purely negative sense, even when we know that we have to have it or exercise it, it still maybe feels bad, or we think of it as being unpleasant or feeling bad, and therefore also probably being unrelated, at least in our subconscious sense of what we're doing, unrelated to love. Because love sounds positive, is positive, feels much easier to give, or if we can dare to use this word in connection with love, to administer, right? So we talk about giving love, we talk about administering discipline, but functionally it's the same thing. There's something that you have that you're giving or handing over to somebody else, right? And they seem to be unrelated to each other, even though the Bible relates discipline to vocations of love, especially to fathers, to mothers, right? So think about Proverbs in this way, which is kind of our great educational manual that we have in the Scriptures. Especially as we talked about in the last hour, the aim of education. What is education's aim? Well, it's not necessarily to make a certain amount of money. It's to become a certain kind of a person who knows the fear of the Lord. When you look at Proverbs, the one who is doing the disciplining is precisely the same person who loves the most. The father is commanded to administer discipline. The mother is the one who is handing on teaching that the son should not forget as he goes out in the world. That's the scenario for Proverbs. Son's going out into the world. There are strange women who are going to lead him astray. At the end of the book, here's the kind of woman he should look for. See how that nice book, beautiful bookend that Solomon sets up there. In between is a lot of admonition about life, and some of it is hard to handle, because it's precisely the kind of lessons the child would learn from his parents, from his teachers, that at the time, unlike maybe if he's really good at math, geometry, unlike geometry, these are things that at the time, when he hears them, he doesn't really understand them, or if he understands them on a verbal level, he doesn't admit or see the necessity of the lesson. So, let your words be few. But he likes talking to his friends, and he likes talking about other people to his friends, and he likes being seen to be smart, and he likes appearing to be first in his group and having the most daring or edgy opinion, or whatever the case may be, whatever the group values. He likes that, so why would he let his words be few? Because when we are administering the discipline, I'm going to say it this way first of all, when we're administering the discipline of teaching someone something, which means that I'm not letting him just run free, go through life, no guidance. I'm teaching him something even beforehand. I'm giving him the benefit not only of certain knowledge that he couldn't otherwise have. Here's something about geometry you didn't know before you came into class today. I am, in the case of wisdom from the Word of God, I'm giving him the benefit of both God's divine teaching about something, along with the wisdom, the practical experience that both the Father in Proverbs is giving. I'm just teaching what Proverbs says. And I myself, by virtue of being older, his parent, his teacher, have seen to be true before he, the student, realizes the need for this truth. That is a kind of a discipline, because I'm asking him to say, yes, I don't know everything. And one of the things constantly observed in both Lindemann and Kahler about students, and Kahler's really good, and that is in English already, right? I mean, it was written in English. It might not be old enough to be on the internet for free, but if you find it on the internet for free, I'm not going to blame you for that, right? And I don't even know that you found it for free on the internet. I don't know. I didn't look. I just go to the seminary library. It's all sitting there, right? So they're both very clear about this, that the child has three parts. They look at the child kind of under three aspects. And this, I think, is helpful for understanding that any teaching is a kind of a discipline, because no three of these aspects to the child is just going to work out by itself. Three aspects. The child's nature, by which they mean his aptitude for learning, his aptitude for remembering things, his physical aptitude. All the different ways in which we all understand when we deal with other human beings for a living especially, people aren't equal. They are extremely different from each other. Okay? Even the people in the same family, right? Some have an aptitude for one thing, some for another. If that goes undisciplined, then you could think of wasted potential. This child's aptitude for mathematics has never been developed because he didn't receive the kind of education in math that would have benefited him and his fellow man if it had been trained. Or that negative aptitude, like negative capacities, right? I don't have the capacity to do this or that, are never corrected or bettered. They're simply left to kind of degenerate. Okay, so I started out not knowing how to swim, and then by the time I was 30, I was actually terrified of water. Because nobody, when I was 5, said, you don't have to be scared, here's how you can begin to learn how to swim. So natural aptitudes, some of which we kind of all share, nobody by nature knowing how to swim, or the ways in which we vary from each other naturally in our gifts. And Lindemann, especially, long before the advent of child psychology as an academic subject, is well aware of these things. Says, Some kids are extremely bright but very reluctant to say anything. Other kids are not very bright and have no reluctance about saying things. And this is it's just, he's very entertaining. I know this sounds like special pleading, but I'm trying to, this forbidding 19th century German man is really very lively, entertaining, okay. Much better than Kaler, really, although he's writing in English. Kaler's a lot more boring, I'm just going to be honest with you. So the child's natural aptitude. The next aspect that they talk a lot about is the child's sinful nature, right? So we said his nature, but then let's drill down and be a little more specific. He also has a sinful nature, right? A sinful nature. And that sinful nature, if you think about it in terms of discipline, this is the part that I think we think about most obviously when we think of the word discipline. That's what needs to be disciplined, such that what is sort of rank or weedy in him doesn't run riot over the garden, right? That the weeds actually get pulled, that the rank growth gets trimmed back. Now, this is said, but it's not all that is said about his sin. There's also attention to the fact that the sinful nature, although common in Adam, is not really commonly expressed. So there are observations very pertinent also to pastors in this, that close knowledge of the child and his family is extremely helpful, as it is for one's own self. Close knowledge of the child and his family is extremely helpful for teaching him. Because you learn, for instance, an example of which public schools are well aware, which is why we have all these reading programs at our libraries, that homeschoolers like myself just hijack by running up the points on the summer reading program real early, because we're patronizing the library all year, and public school kids just only got to go to the library during the week, in July, and we're already done with the reading program, lots of people are aware of this, that if, for instance, the child never reads at home, not only will reading come more difficult, it will come with greater difficulty, but also he will have less interest. The reason that this is not just discussed in that sheer pedagogical manner is because Lindemann and Kaler's aim is not necessarily just to make good readers or kids that are good at completing their arithmetic assignments. Because you're interested in actually changing the child's soul through the Lutheran school, the discipline of his nature, his sinful nature, is a chief concern of the teacher. It's in fact what they're going to spend most of their time instructing teachers in. So if you pick up Lindemann, just if you look at the flow, the organization of the book, most of it is not about classroom instruction. Most of it is about the handling of the child's soul, and that's all Kaler is about, right? And part of that is because there are instructional supplements to Kaler. So there's a whole book, The Teaching of Mathematics, The Teaching of Religion, The Teaching of English. These are all independent volumes, but the main thing that they understand the Lutheran teacher to be doing is to be guiding the child's soul. It's not primarily about the specific subject matter being conveyed, although we'll see after lunch, there is specific subject matter, and the curriculum is very heavily weighted towards certain things rather than others. Right? But because the chief thing is the guiding of the child's soul, the knowledge of the child's sinful nature, and how that is expressed, and how that changes over time. So Lindemann says, for example, the girls are going to mature faster and then kind of stop. The boys will mature very slowly, and their development will not even be done when they get out of your school, which is universally in his time, 8th grade. So you'll have girls that are behaving like they will when they're 45, when they're 13, and you'll have boys who are behaving like they're 10 when they're 14, because they won't be men until they're 20. And so attention to that and how that gets expressed also in the kinds of sins they commit is a very main concern. This last aspect in looking at the child that's common, and the reason that all teaching is a kind of a discipline, is the child's regenerate nature. Okay? So again, you can see here the presumption is that the Lutheran school is not a missionary agency in the sense that we mean that today, where I just bring in whoever for, let's be honest, whatever extremely practical, usually financial reasons, right? There's no reason to beat around the bush about this. This is a means of keeping schools open. I bring them in. They are not, in fact, Christians, and they may or may not be Christians by the time they graduate. We will have conveyed a certain amount of stuff to them, but they may or may not. The presumption is always, in both Lindemann and Kahler, that the child in a Christian school is a Christian. They don't consider other alternatives. Okay? So that's definitely something for discussion, but that is certainly their presumption. Because of that, the child doesn't just have natural aptitudes. He's really good at basketball, and he's pretty good at reading, and he's really bad at math. He doesn't just have a sinful nature, so he's prone to fits of anger. He also has a regenerate nature, which in Christ needs to be trained. It needs to be trained because it doesn't know on its own exactly what to do. Okay? So simply because he's been baptized doesn't mean that he knows how to forgive someone. He doesn't know how to exercise the self-control that is part of the fruit of the Spirit. He doesn't know that. It has to not only be taught in a Bible lesson, it also has to be, and this is a much greater stress for both Lindemann and Kahler, it also has to be modeled. The way that I originally got into this subject matter is because I was doing my doctoral work on when Paul tells people, imitate me. What does he mean and why is he telling people that? I can answer that kind of some other time, but the thing that is opposite to our discussion today is that the reason Paul does that is because he understands that personal example is far more powerful as a lesson than practically anything else. So in the example that we brought up in the last hour from 2 Thessalonians, when he says, you have an example in me, the example they have is, it's not just that I worked to support the founding of this congregation. I didn't want to burden you, the Thessalonians, by having to pay me in the beginning so we could have a church. I worked and I set you an example. Follow my example. The presumption here is never that the teacher is perfect. The presumption here is that the teacher is a Christian and therefore can set a Christian, not a perfect, but a regenerate Christian example. Okay? That's something distinguished from being perfect. You don't have to pretend to be, and when they're with you enough, they know you're not, right? You don't have to stop and tell them, by the way, I'm not perfect, right? Especially when they're with you all the time. It's a little easier in the seminary to pretend that the professors are perfect because they only come to certain classes, right? They don't live with us, but I live on campus, so they see my kids not come into dinner when I call them into dinner, and then I yell at them, and then that's not purely my regenerate nature disciplining them, that's also I'm angry, and they see that, so they know that I'm not perfect at least, right? But that takes a certain amount of living with other people. You don't have to say I'm not perfect, but you are setting a kind of example, right? So all teaching is discipline in this regard because none of those three aspects of a child will grow in the right direction or be pruned back, in the case of the sinful nature, in the right way without discipline. Right? All growth is going to require pruning. Right? All teaching is a discipline. What that means is that when we're thinking about discipline, we're thinking really about an ongoing process. So by saying discipline, I really mean the same thing that gets covered we don't really use this word as much in the Lutheran Church. I'm trying to rehabilitate the word because I think it's a fine English noun. Discipleship. That is that the school exists for discipleship. It exists to carry out, Monday through Friday, the work that the church is doing in making disciples. Okay. Now that's going to have a very specifically Lutheran shape that we'll see, especially when we look at curricula and methods in the afternoon, or scope more broadly, and methods. But the word itself, although generally used by evangelicals in the English language, is not therefore a bad word. We just need to give it our own content. But the work is really the same. The presumption is these children are Christians. They have to be trained how to be Christians. The school is the agency that does so for the congregation when they are between a certain set of ages that we'll talk about, especially in the afternoon. Okay? So the school, in this way, is administering the discipline of teaching, and its existence and that teaching is, we saw, not merely like, I want you to be this way. It is grounded in and motivated by the love of God in Christ Jesus that the parish and the school both convey, right? One generally just on Sundays, okay, with the exception of feast days and midweeks, and the other Monday through Friday, throughout the Lutheran school year, which we'll talk about in the afternoon, isn't the same thing as the school year we now have. It always ends on Palm Sunday, and we'll talk about why that was. But that means, so then you're done, right? You're almost done. You're close to the end of the school year if you were really going back to tradition, okay? But when you think about this as discipleship, or discipline if you want, whichever word you want to use, that means that we're looking for, in the children, a certain depth that is not going to be satisfied with just, you went to confirmation class for this number of hours kind of after school, and that's your Christian discipleship, but then most of what you learned didn't really involve Christianity, right? Either in the environment, or in the examples being set, or in certainly the teaching being conveyed, right? Most of your life had to do with something other than Christianity, and then sort of in time that was the same sort of spare time devoted to baseball practice or piano lessons or whatever, in that time we also fit in the knowledge of Jesus Christ, which was conveyed in confirmation class, right? In maybe a release time situation or Wednesday nights or whatever the arrangement was. You can see that doesn't really convey the sense that their main identity is as disciples of Jesus Christ. It conveys a sense that discipleship is a sort of more or less a spare time activity. You can see how what we talked about in the last hour with sacrifice and presumptions we don't really talk about, and all of that plays into what I just said. That when parents, grandparents, the children themselves, congregation members, maybe even leadership, maybe even the pastor, don't see discipleship as the main thing that the school is doing, the reason it exists, simply out of love for the children who are in the parish, then justifying its existence, let alone the depth of instruction, the breadth of instruction that it's there to convey, it just doesn't really make sense. It just doesn't really make sense. If I'm thinking of a school as basically just, I'm going to learn some things and then I'm going to get a job, or I can learn that in my spare time, then asking people to send their children there or to sacrifice, asking people to become teachers, isn't going to make much, it just doesn't make much sense. And this is why I think, not necessarily our school system, about which I'm no expert, but I do know something about the history of our schools. That's why those ratios that I discussed in the first hour have changed so drastically, where the number of congregations is so much greater than the number of schools, where the number of teachers or people trained to be teachers shrinks, right? The reason being is that I think when things change in the church, they change in a way that the Bible says they do, which is in a leaven-like way. Mysteriously growing, but generally based on things that are kind of deeper than maybe formal affirmations, So formally, you can still find Missouri Synod Lutherans saying things like, Lutheran schools are such a great gift, or Lutheran schools are so important, but underneath, the same dynamic of those ratios changing drastically continues on. So my question is, well, what do we actually believe? And I think that what we actually believe is that discipling of children can take place sort of willy-nilly, and the Lutheran school is maybe not necessarily there even to educate Lutheran children. Maybe it's there as a missionary agency or whatever else. And so, therefore, these things by and by just sort of pass away. Yeah. So this understanding of discipline, of teaching as a discipline, and then also the discipline necessary to the student, is all going to be grounded in something on which Lindemann especially spends an enormous amount of time, and that is the teacher's self-discipline. So let me start with how the teacher administers the discipline that we talked about, and then talk about a few other things about personal characteristics, some of which we already mentioned. Friendliness, liveliness. How the teacher administers discipline, because, and this is really fun, Lindemann is a very organized thinker, so it makes it easy to read him, because he has 3 different means by which discipline is administered by a Lutheran teacher, specifically a Lutheran teacher. Okay. And he says only one of these means is available to the teacher in the public school, and that is what he calls the rod. Okay. So just by the by, corporal punishment is discussed in both Lindemann and in Kahler. Kahler is a little more hesitant about it. I think that's probably familiar to us culturally. It's not really at all controversial in the 1870s for anyone anywhere that corporal punishment exists in schools. Even in the 1930s it's not, but Kahler has a few more qualifying words like, this is the last thing you do, kind of thing. But it's not out of the question. There are admonitions in both of them that harshness or the entrance of one's own anger into corporal punishment is the absolute worst reason to have corporal punishment. So they're not against its existence, and they say it's especially useful with boys as they grow older, because unless physically confronted, even with just the threat of your body kind of looming over them, they're just, some of them are not, they simply won't otherwise listen, okay? So they don't see corporal punishment as sort of like, if you like getting angry, do this. They see it as sometimes a necessity, okay, for the discipline of certain children, okay? But it's a last resort for both of them. Neither of them is really all that interested in it. Because, and this is I think a very interesting insight, they say, if this is available to the most common word for what we call public schools is government schools, or state schools in the early Missouri Synod. They don't think of them as public, and you say public library, they think of them as government-run, government or state schools, is that the government's job is to restrain by force. If that's all we're able to do in a Lutheran school, we have failed. Because we're basically just police for kids at that point, which a government school could do just as well as we do. So it's one means, corporal punishment is one means, it's a last resort in both cases, but its use is not really controversial for either one of them. And that is grounded in Proverbs, right? The sparing of the rod, especially for the male child, is ultimately not going to be helpful to him. Even if just the threat of it will suffice, that's fine. It's still the threat of punishment. The 2 other means that are specific to the Lutheran teacher are these. The proper distinction of law and gospel, I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. The other one is prayer. Let me do that one first because I think it's a little less complex. Prayer is going to help the Lutheran teacher orient himself, or for Kahler herself, because by 1930 we're getting much closer to kind of 50-50 men, women in the teacher profession. Prayer is going to orient you properly, and I talk about this with the students at the seminary too when we talk about being a pastor. It's going to orient you properly to the people under your care. When you pray for them, you just will not think about them the same way you do when you're not praying for them. Favoritism or some kind of neglect, or I really like teaching these kids but not these two who sit over here in this corner. And that's all natural. That's part of both your natural like or dislike for people and your sinful nature. Yours, not the child's. So when you're praying for them, especially by name, maybe you just print out a class list or work through it in the morning briefly, it's going to change your attitude both to them and also to the problems and the joys that you have with and because of them. Okay. So that is a means available to you, and it doesn't actually indicate administering anything to them, but it does, as prayer generally does, it changes your attitude toward both joys and burdens. Proper distinction between law and gospel, right? Which we think of it, we talk about in connection with preaching, we talk about in connection with the pastoral ministry generally. I would say, and this remains to be written somewhere, but I would say that the way that both C.F.W. Walther's book, Law and Gospel, discuss that, as well as how Lindemann and Kaler discuss that, is not as a sort of like robotic technique, like, oh, this kid's crying, so now I'm going to say gospel words, right? Or this little girl is screaming her head off, so now I say law words to get her to stop. It's more that law and gospel as a way of either shaking up a secure sinner with the law, or teaching a sinner who doesn't know enough about how to walk in God's ways. That would be guiding, right? That regenerate nature. Or conversely, comforting a child in Jesus Christ, or filling him with the knowledge of Jesus Christ and what he's done for us. Those are things that describe your overarching approach to what you are doing. So it's not like okay, use this Bible verse when they're crying, use this Bible verse when they're crying for the right reason, when they're yelling for the right reason. You know, it's not robotic. It's that understanding the difference between what both informs but also terrifies, and then what conversely consoles and comforts and fills with peace. That is essential to what you're doing, right? It is essential to your vocation. It's not a mere technique to be deployed for the purposes of a sermon or a lesson, not even a Bible history lesson. It is your overarching approach to the people under your care, whether your students or a congregation or whatever else. Or, just as a father or mother, your children. Okay. Yeah?
Would you say it's more emotional than theological, or?
I would say that what we think of as theology and then is kind of abstract or merely a technique in a sermon is theology is actually practical for teachers and for pastors, and therefore involves the understanding of human emotion, but is not solely emotional or psychological. Okay? So that is, your job is not only to know the theology, but it's especially to know the people and then how to use the Word of God for those people. And that's how the proper distinction plays into this. So this gets, Lindemann discusses this at length. Kaler does it at a little bit less length. But the overarching purpose of knowing this is so that you understand what are you doing? You're not just teaching math. You're not just teaching reading. You're not just teaching writing. That's really cool, and it's really great when they figure out how to read or figure out how to do what it is that you taught them to do. That's wonderful. But the reason that you are teaching as a Lutheran and in a Lutheran school is because you are caring for souls most of all, right? In the case of the school, in the stead of the parents, and in the stead of the congregation that cares about its lambs, right? So you want to know how God's word can be properly understood and applied so that you can do that for the children. That's part of your self-discipline. In addition to that, the teacher's discipline, especially his self-discipline, is going to extend to the way that they talk about gifts. So they've got, I'm just giving you these really clearly organized categories. I didn't come up with this. Okay, so you have them to thank for the clarity. There are natural gifts, and supernatural gifts, right? Isn't that nice? It's just so well organized, right? Okay, so let me talk about supernatural gifts because it's most related to what we just talked about. And then we'll talk about natural gifts because I think natural gifts also involves understanding who should be a teacher, right? Who should be a teacher. Because the supernatural gifts are not so easily identified and they are much longer in acquiring. The supernatural gifts would be, for instance, and a lot of these are going to be common to pastors, even that distinction between natural and supernatural gifts comes up in pastoral theologies, Walther's, Wilhelm Leah's, as well as instruction for teachers. But the supernatural gifts would involve, for example, the development of patience. So this is interesting. When they talk about what we would call someone's temperament, he gets angry easily, or he's very emotionally cold, or very emotionally hot, or something like that. They don't actually file that under sinful or regenerate. They just file it under natural. Okay, so they don't think about the fact that someone, and this is interesting, so they would not confuse patience with the fact that you are just relatively emotionally unexpressive, which I think is very perceptive, because most people confuse social behavior for virtue. That is, if I'm not easily perturbed, that doesn't actually mean I'm a patient person. It just means I'm not displaying my impatience with other people. Right? So this is the difference between, this is the difference between, say, a Judas and a Peter. Think about when Judas expresses himself. Not all that often prior to our Lord's passion. What is building inside of him all that time? There is, for instance, a certain impatience with how other people spend money and his sense that he knows better. There's also, obviously, we see worked out in his behavior, a certain greed, which, if we actually confuse virtues with behaviors, we would think, well, Judas is a better disciple than Peter because he doesn't screw up as much publicly. But it turns out in the end, he's not. Right? So Peter's behaviors are more, let's say, disruptive, okay, of the group, of the master's teaching. This doesn't mean that Peter is actually not so good a disciple as Judas. So it's very interesting that they file behaviors or temperaments, most of which are natural because you can see them coherently even in a person like Paul in the Bible before and after conversion. Is Paul lazy before conversion? No. Is Paul eloquent and kind of a leader before conversion? Yes. Is he very busy and very eloquent and very forceful after conversion? Yes. That the temperament is just turned to better purposes, but is going to be there. Right? And you can learn to control it or direct it differently, but it's going to be there. So in the teacher, the supernatural gifts, for instance, patience, is not necessarily the same thing as you know how to bite your tongue. It's that you're actually willing to bear with the child longer and longer, either in some just point of instruction or in a spiritually specific way as the child struggles with this or goes through that or whatever the case may be. Okay? The supernatural gifts such as patience, devotion to one's calling, these are developed over time. The natural gifts, they generally will list off. Kaler does this just as Lindemann does. Lindemann just being more compendious than Kaler. And the natural gifts are more easily identified. So, for example, if your temperament is very, very, very flat, maybe you just shouldn't teach kids. Because you need a certain level of expressive energy to stay with them. It is the ultimate young man's game, right? Is teaching kids. No matter what your age is, you have to somehow come somewhere near their level of native energy, right? In which they're going to be, no matter how young you are as a teacher, you're not as young and energetic as they are, so they're always beating you at energy, but you need some of it, right? So some amount of energy, a certain liveliness of presentation, a capacity of intellectual sympathy, right? And this is something that I stress very extensively with the seminary students, is that if you neither know nor are able to enter into the way that your people understand things, you will not be able to change them as you teach them, okay, in a fruitful direction, because you don't know what they think, nor do you know why, right? So it may be that two people think the exact same thing, and you're teaching on a sheer factual basis that that is half right, and you're going to teach the other half to complete the picture. But what if those two people think something for totally different reasons? One because he found it on the internet, the other because it is just sort of his family's predilection. Okay? Well, the motivation for changing their thoughts is going to be very different, because one is a lot deeper than the other one, and therefore a lot more rooted than the other one, and you understand how this works. So the self-discipline of the teacher is both consist in these supernatural gifts that are developed over time. They also consist in natural gifts that can or cannot be identified. This did go into both the scale, but also the nature of training at our first two teachers' colleges, and the other ways in which teachers were trained, because sometimes teachers would be, for instance, a lot of the change in the gender ratio in the teachers of the Missouri Synod happens because of expansion and insufficient supply from, stop me if you've heard this problem before, insufficient supply from the colleges. So where do we get teachers for our schools from? Well, we get them from the congregation. Right? And so, not coincidentally, you're kind of farther west, closer to the frontier teachers' college at Seward, admits women, I believe, from the first, because the frontier congregations are familiar with this situation where we don't even know who to write to get a teacher. So, she's willing and ready to teach. Like, let's do this, right? So that's part of how that changes. But how do I identify who should be teaching? If I don't have a sense that the person is both intellectually capable, not only of knowing, but also of relating, then the natural gifts just are not there. If I know that I need both these natural gifts, but also supernatural gifts, which will be developed over time, but would involve knowledge of God's Word, patience in teaching it, love for those under the teacher's care. If I can identify those, then I can also recruit for those things. And so there is an intentionality about these lists, that they're not just for teaching teachers who are sitting there in class and it's sort of already too late once I've packed my stuff off to this teacher's college. I need to figure out how to be a good teacher because I already decided to be a good teacher. So my parents sent me here. So it's too late, right? Okay. But that even before that, if you have that list, you can begin to actually ask people, do you think you would want to do this? Do you think this would be something worthwhile? Is this something that you... Because the school does not maintain itself, right? Either in the sense of the building and the upkeep for that, and what are we going to set tuition at, and what is that going to be for members? Is it going to be for members, and on and on and on. The group of teachers, the teacherette as a group, does not maintain itself either. And so if there is not something intentional about passing this on to new people, then it itself also quickly goes away. I think one way to recruit, and this is where we'll end, and we can take a couple of questions before we eat lunch if you have them. I think one of the best ways to recruit for things like this is not only to identify aptitude, but also to explain very clearly and as urgently as you possibly can, according to your temperament, as urgently as you possibly can, what the point is. The point is not that you get to teach math. You love math, you get to teach math. The point is not even that you get to teach Bible stories because you love the Bible and you love studying the Bible and you know all the helps that have been published over the years, including Kretzmann's popular commentary, to help teachers explain the Bible better in Lutheran schools. You know, too, that the end here is that you want the child to know Jesus Christ, and that you're not really satisfied with what he may or may not be picking up, let's say, in the sermon on Sunday. So you want him to know Jesus Christ deeply and broadly, and you want to devote yourself to those things, right? And that is the point of all of the various ways and the various roles that our church has always historically had, but most historically and most often, obviously pastors, but also very historically and nearly as often teachers, for helping all of our people, but especially our children, to know Jesus Christ broadly and deeply. Okay? That's the point. That's what you're recruiting people for, not just for teaching the wide variety of things that will need to be taught, right? And we'll talk about that scale of schooling and who taught what in the next hour, but let's take questions or comments if you have them now. Anybody? So it's before lunch, so you're stopping people from eating. If you're asking a question, go ahead. Yeah.
Once again, I tried to pick up what you were putting out, the difference between supernatural and natural, and then you had virtues versus behaviors. Are those, am I mismatching those?
Yes. Behaviors obviously have something to do with supernatural gifts. I may behave impatiently because I have not, you do not ask, therefore you do not receive. I did not ask for patience, so I'm just expressing my natural impatience. There's a supernatural problem there. These things are not, they can be distinguished, but they're not separate in a person. Okay? But what I was saying with virtues and behaviors is, especially when you're thinking about the virtue of patience, that you have to tell the difference between those two things in a child. Because if you mistake behavior for the entirety of the person's character, you've made a severe mistake. That's all I was saying there. It's a specific example of how to exercise patience in teaching. Simply because behavior is not the entirety of who the person is. That's all. Yeah. Tells you a lot, it just doesn't tell you everything. Yeah. Other questions, other thoughts, other comments? Anybody? Oh, yeah, yes, sir.
I was just thinking back about my own Lutheran school, and this gets to the use of corporal punishment. Our principal, when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, I think he's 1950 to report school. And he's still alive. And I recall how he would discipline children differently depending on the kid and what you were saying, because this is before the advent of ADHD. And so we just called all our friends that got into trouble hyper, right?
Right, yeah. I remember that word, yeah. Yeah.
And it turns out those are the guys that always would get spankings,
Yep.
right? And, but I remember he used corporal punishment in a way that it was clear that a very bright line had to be crossed.
Yeah.
Right. And we all knew what those were, right? And especially if you were messing around in chapel.
Yeah.
You know, that was
Yep.
if you messed around in chapel, you were getting it.
Right. Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But then I remember kind of towards the end when he retired, towards the end of elementary school, that the next teacher was a more recent, progressive one, and that all went away. And the feel of the place changed.
Yeah, big time, yep, yeah. Yeah, especially that sense of specific spaces have specific behaviors, and that some behaviors are like, I don't want you to do that, but you're going to get whispered to, and then others I'm going to take you out, and then others I'm going to take you out and I'm going to spank you, right? That there are different, that life is relatively clear, and because, and I mean, this is why we eat at the same time in my family every day, because children flourish when there is clarity, right? When there is a lack of clarity, they're confused, and then they react in ways that are embarrassing or destructive or whatever, but your heart goes out to them because they're doing that partly because they don't know where the lines are. And they don't, by nature, know where the lines should be set. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else? All right. thank you. So we'll come back after lunch. I guess we'll probably pray now. So I'll be back with you after we.
All right, everybody. The food is, yeah, it's here. Hi, everything's ready. All right, let us pray. The eyes of all look to you, O Lord, and you give them their food at the proper time. You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Lord God, Heavenly Father, bless us in these thy gifts which we receive from thy bountiful goodness, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right, Bonnie, Ann, you want to give us some instruction at all?
Just give us about 2 minutes.
That's good instruction. All right.
We came back suddenly. We'll go for, let's do another 45. I think that works well. That'll leave us at least an hour at the end after our last break, in which we'll combine methods with whatever Q&A you want to discuss. Like I said, in the morning, these sections are a little looser than the morning was. The morning, it was really more of my own synthesis. Not that I'm contributing zero opinion in the afternoon, but simply that I'm interested in conveying some things that are both, especially differ from their time, 1870s, 1930s, to ours, compare and contrast both the scope of education and also the methods that they use, some of which have actually come back, especially at classical schools, but which still differ from the past pretty radically. So let's talk about scope, and this begins with what they thought they were doing in Lutheran schools. What kind of a school, besides the specifically Christian things that we talked about in the morning, what kind of a school was a Lutheran school? It was within the kind of, let's say, taxonomy of schools available at the time, with public schools calling themselves common schools, or comprehensive schools, or boarding schools. Within that taxonomy, a Lutheran school didn't have an English name. They did not use any English words, not even sort of by way of half-hearted translation. They called it a Volksschule. That means a people's school. And what that means is that anybody can go there. Okay. So we said in the morning that, okay, but they assumed that the children not only had a natural temperament, but they had a sinful nature, and that they had a regenerate nature, that is, that the children were Christians. So what do they mean anybody can go there? They mean if your dad is a farmer, if your dad is a banker, if your dad is a pastor, you can go to this school. And that was a vision of education that really wasn't that old. It really wasn't that old. Parallels to that in Lutheran countries were pretty new, honestly. So there was something a little, not very, don't worry, but a little innovative about the Missouri Synod trying to extend education as a formal process, not just catechesis, but reading, writing, math, all of it, to any child of the congregation. Okay? That wasn't that common. Your best precedents for this, and so also obviously the source of our what we now call our public school system, is colonial New England. I mean, it's not even common in thoroughly Protestant countries such as pre-Civil War America, that everyone receives an education, is supposed to know how to read, is supposed to know how to write, and so on. And there will still be wide variance between American states down into the early 20th century where, in Connecticut, you can't really find an adult who is native born, at least, who doesn't know how to read and write. And in maybe in Oklahoma, or even a state that you don't think of as particularly backward or something like California, where just school attendance is not as common, you can find adults who can't read and write. Okay? So the Missouri Synod is trying to provide schooling for everybody. The school is also generally what we think of it now as a one-room school. Everybody is pretty much in often a single room. And if you remember why, or you remember the ratios we talked about, I think in the first hour today, because so often the pastor is also the school teacher, and I said that your congregation was unusual in being big enough to have a pastor and a teacher who are separate individuals, right? But especially if the pastor is the teacher, then the schoolroom is somewhere in the parsonage. Okay? Or I've seen arrangements where the schoolroom was behind the altar, or lots of things. Okay, just whatever works. Or sometimes the sanctuary could become the schoolroom, whatever you needed to happen. So anyone can come. The environment is let's say an ungraded school. We don't really use that. We still say grade school, but it used to be contrasted to ungraded, and ungraded was normal, meaning you've got everybody, right, all together, and you have somehow to instruct them all together. So how are you going to go about doing that? This is why I think there is such a difference in Lindemann, 1870s, to Kaler, 1930s, in the insistence on discipline and quiet. And it's not that those things became less important. It's that the urgency for the individual teacher was not quite so great, because by the time you have Kaler, you even have like Lutheran high schools. And they have been disciplined since they started school, so you can presume some kind of discipline or quiet. Yeah?
You said you have everybody. Can you tell us about what age level? I think kindergarten is kind of comes later.
Yeah, right? Kindergarten comes later. Kindergarten, the Missouri Synod is culturally in touch with Germany, but not really interested in kindergarten. Kindergarten in America is a New England experiment first, as are a lot of things about America. So we don't really do kindergarten. We do grade 1, and we go to grade 8.
About 7 years old.
Yeah, maybe 7. So sort of like if you've ever looked into Finland's school system, they have these really great math and reading scores on these international standardized tests. And the Finns are sort of notable in the world now for not teaching reading until you're like 7 or 8 years old. Some of you looked into this. That was normal, right? So let me just say now, and then I see your hand. Let me just say now is that the school year too. I mentioned this earlier. The school year ends for a Lutheran school at Palm Sunday, and that is why confirmation is yoked to Palm Sunday, sort of historically. The Lutheran school year begins whenever is most convenient for the congregation. Because again, remember, just regulation is low or non-existent, right? So you don't have to have so many days of instruction or this kind of certification or that, or you start when you want to. And so school will generally start after harvest and end by Palm Sunday. And in between then, we'll talk about some of the subjects in a second, but that's the age range and that's the time range. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Back here.
So this is personal. Like you were saying, they didn't necessarily start as early as we're starting in kindergarten.
Yeah.
In your homeschooling, when do you officially start?
We start, like the 4-year-old right now is listening to Greek myths with the 7-year-old. So it's not hurting him, you know what I mean? I think he will be ready as well. He's definitely our kind of hyper fluent. So he could probably learn how to read next year if I wanted to. That hasn't been for everybody though. So it's flexible. And again, I think that especially with these very pragmatic questions, I think congregational schools should have the same kind of freedom. Like, if you're if you're 7, like I don't need to push you to be exactly like this other 7-year-old. I don't know enough to say, here's how you do this, or you are doing that, or whatever, but it certainly works better in homeschool because some 7-year-olds are ready to start reading, and some have been reading for 2 years or 3 years in some cases, but yeah. other questions right now? So you've got the basic age range. You've got a sense of the classroom. The classroom is ungraded as a norm. Graded schools are going to be very rare. And you've got a sense of the age range. Separate from that world is the way that we teach kids who are going to be pastors. Okay, so the Missouri Synod is not doing classical schooling historically, except for people who are going to be pastors. Okay, so they're going to eventually exit this people's school system, and we can talk curricula in a second to contrast them, but they'll exit that roughly at what we call 7th grade. They're using a German series of grading that we won't fully drop until we close the senior college in 1976. But even the idea of you got a junior college and then you have a senior and all of this sort of thing, there are remnants of a German academic system that at first they explicitly have. So you're going to go away to what's effectively going to be boarding school, unless you live near a major city, when you're roughly in what we think of as 7th grade, and then you exit that when you graduate the St. Louis Seminary. If you didn't enter that system, you go to the other seminary. Or if you are not if you are not culturally German, you go to the other seminary. Now at the other seminary, you have to learn German to take the classes, but that's where you go if you're a Finn, or a Slovak, or Italian, or Polish, or if you are a native English speaker. You go to Springfield. Everybody else inside the system ends up at St. Louis, and that person has had Latin and Greek from very early on. He's probably had Hebrew in what we think of as high school. And eventually those feeder schools turn into the Concordias. Some of them close. Some of them were born and died without turning into much of anything, like that's Concordia, New Orleans. So those things, but there is a classical education system. It's for the clergy, but especially, in the informal sort of social ranking of our church, the elite clergy. Okay, so classical education is not the primary vision, and it's not what is being done on the local level in the parish school. Let me talk a little bit about curriculum. What are they teaching? They are teaching vastly predominantly Bible history, and I'll say how that's different from just the Bible history and catechism. And most of Lindemann's specific instructions, so he's got a general methodology section, pretty long. We did a lot of that in the last hour. He's got specific methodologies for each of the subjects they teach. Most of that is devoted to teaching Bible history and catechism. Those are both the teacher's responsibility. Okay. So Bible history is not the same thing as what we do like in a Sunday morning Bible class today in a Missouri Synod congregation. Bible history is at first collections of stories. You probably have maybe used these old Bible history references books. We still have 100 Bible stories. These are all English language descendants, sometimes even translations of older textbooks originally intended for Lutheran schools to teach the Bible as a narrative. This is the primary way in which the Bible is then learned, right? The Bible is not learned as a source of, there are verses that are memorized. We'll talk about memorization a little bit later in this section, but it's primarily a set of narratives centering, obviously, in the death and resurrection of Jesus. Everything runs into from the Old Testament and out of that, and what's remarkable about these Bible history, where you can see even the books that they used, is how much Old Testament was taught and assumed as knowledge. Okay? Along with a lot of very specific geographic detail about the ancient Near East, along with a pretty rigorous timeline. So they'll even date very often. They'll give you like BC, so this happened in 1760 BC, but the child is also required to memorize not only the date to the birth of Christ, but also the date from the creation of the world. Okay, at the same time. So those kinds of things, the Bible is taught as a series of interconnected narratives centering on Jesus Christ, and that is the chief subject. So that obviously goes along with what we talked about in the first two sessions about if this is primarily about the discipleship of a Christian child, then obviously the primary subject is Bible history. Okay? Equal attention is not given, let's say, to practical things like learning how to read and impractical things like theology. The main thing is theology conveyed through Bible history on the one hand, and on the other through catechism. So there is, for example, and this really could be its own teacher training day, there is this enormous, certainly by our standards, enormous catechism that was brought and only slightly revised, brought from Germany and slightly revised by the Missouri Synod, called Dietrich's Catechism. It's large. If you actually memorize the questions and the answers, you should be given a PhD by, St. Louis in theology. Like, you're good to go. You know more than most of the pastors, guaranteed. Okay, so the questions are extensive. You can get them in a Latin-German edition. Okay, Latin not for the local school kids, but most of them are going to be in German, and the format reflects how it was taught. So Bible history is taught as a series of narratives that you're expected to then retell. So the teacher is, in teaching Bible history, not just somebody that says, okay, John, you read these 5 verses. You are retelling the story. So Lindemann suggests, for example, that when you are teaching a story about war in the Old Testament, that you bring in a bow and arrow, and you show them what a quiver looks like. That especially when you have obscure words in the Bible text, that's when you find the liveliest possible way of explaining them. Okay? So Bible history requires storytelling. Catechism requires a capacity for asking questions pertinently. Okay? So what you'll find in these formats of catechisms, and this exists less in our 2017 catechism update. I don't know how many of you have looked at that. I'm honestly not a fan. I think it says way too much stuff. The older format, and by older, I'm going all the way back to 1991, okay? It's not that long ago, okay? I won't tell you how old I was in 1991. Some of you are going to be angry at me. 1991 or 1943 or things before that. The format shows you how it was taught. It's questions and answers. The art of catechizing is figuring out how to ask those questions and all the ones in between that are going to get the class from this question about angels to this question about the Bible, or just to figure out what we're saying in this thing about angels that we're memorizing. Okay. And so this is where Lindemann says not only is the questioning method one of the best methods for instruction, so you can find it throughout time, it is also the method most often used by our Lord. Lindemann likes, when he's talking about specific methodology, to get references from especially the Gospels, and he says our Lord delights to ask questions that people have to answer for themselves. Okay? That he's not asking questions in ways that are there to deliver rote answers. So this is very interesting, because it means that there are things learned by rote, but they are not necessarily the way that you are instructing. That the rote memorization of things, which he believes is very necessary, especially of Bible texts and the catechism, rote memorization is a different time in the day than teaching Bible history or catechism. Teaching Bible history is story, catechism is Q&A, rote memorization of Bible and catechism are a separate thing altogether. Okay, so this is very, I mean, they could be separated like, okay, now I'm no longer asking questions, now we're just going to memorize this for the next 2 minutes, but they're distinct from each other. And the reason he does that is because Lindemann especially, will line up the method with the topic. And then the method, not only with the topic, but also with the pupil. So, for example, in a younger pupil, I'm trying to just inculcate that it is David, not Jesus or Moses or John, some other Bible name that he's heard of. It is David who slew Goliath. That's all I'm trying to convey. With an older student, maybe I'm trying to convey, here's the weaponry, okay, and this is where I bring my bow and everything in. Here's the weaponry David could have used, or here's a sword, this is what he tried to use, and it didn't fit, and the armor didn't fit, and so he just threw it off, and then he digs down in the rocks, and he pulls up some stones out of the river, and he puts them in his sling, and now he's ready to go, right? So now the student is focusing on, okay, well, how did David slay Goliath? And then maybe with an older student still, I'm conveying that this somehow involves a very abstract concept for a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old, which is the honor of God's name. This is the reason David wants to slay Goliath, right? So I'm going to adapt my method of instruction both to the topic. I want the Bible to be liveliest of all, to the topic, but also to the pupil. Now, you say, how is he doing this in an ungraded school? I have no idea. I think that what he does is that he takes the time for, let's say, memorization, or there are two things that he believes the pupil should, if the school can afford them, bring with him to the school and home every day. Can you guess what those are? 2 things. A Bible, and I'm glad that you said that, but that's not as obvious in the 19th century as it is to us. A Bible. He wants every student to be supplied with a complete Bible, not just a New Testament. A Bible and a hymn book is that the student, like what you're going to do is you say, okay, these 15 need to do this, so they're going to go over here and they're going to read John chapter 1 quietly while I tell David and Goliath to the little guys. You see, so he's moving the students around, he's grouping them, sometimes this group, that group, by age, by ability, by whatever, and then, you know, they're doing something silent over here while everyone else is being directly taught over here. The amount of energy that requires, upshifting, downshifting, is incredible to me. Okay, but that, it seems, that's how I have filled in the gap. Otherwise, I do not know how he accomplishes storytelling, questioning, right, especially attuned to the student's ability. Questioning, they're going to read the Bible, you're going to memorize this hymn. I don't know how else he does it. Okay? The most intensive instruction is given to Bible history and catechism. What comes besides that? They are all taught conjointly German and English. Now, the German is great. It's standard High German, so the students, and Lindemann actually says, most of them speak some dialect. You must fix it. Okay, so if they say, so you had the German word for a or an is ein or eine or eines. Okay, so if they say en or ein or enis or eine, you fix it, right? So make sure that they pronounce things the right way. In English, this is not going to surprise you, he's shakier and sketchier, okay? So it's like, make sure that they know how to write. I mentioned this earlier, German cursive is a completely different kind of a cursive than English cursive. The students learn both, okay? But this is one of the places where I want to begin to draw this distinction between what is therefore historical for our Lutheran schools and what we mean by a classical Lutheran school. When they learn cursive, they're not learning it for some higher purpose or because it's beautiful or something. They're learning cursive as a matter of business practicality. So they're not even learning English cursive because any of the teachers have any particular investment in the English language. Or really, and if you read memoirs, it's widely admitted that these generally German-born teachers don't pronounce English very well. That the students are better at English than they are, right, before they get to... But that they're learning it as a matter of business practicality, so they can read documents and write documents and sign things and understand what's going on, right? Even as farmers, they need to do this for contractual purposes and so on. So even their teaching of what we think of as cursive has a very different historical context, so it ends up with a different purpose. You had a question back here?
How long is their school day?
Their school day I can't tell exactly from Lindemann. It anecdotally from other historical things I read appears to begin earlier.
Were
And
they all present at the same time, or was it a common?
when school is in session, everybody's there. But remember, I mean, like school could only be in session from, mid-October to beginning of April. I mean, you're kind of, and then you're done. So it's a dark time of year in general. But yeah, there are so many stories about students having to start fires. That gives you a sense of how early it is. Yeah.
You can, well, this is just our own local history. You can see some of the old student lanes that they would take, especially from the west side of the interstate, and how they would all get together and then walk over here.
Mm-hmm.
It had to get up early in the morning.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Pastor,
Yeah, go ahead.
since a lot of them were being groomed to be pastors, were there very many girls in the older Lutheran schools in the early
Yeah,
days?
it's everybody.
Was it?
It's everybody. Yeah, so the parochial school is for anybody who is a child of the congregation. And even the notion of who the pastors are, especially the ones that are going to go into the system, are usually a pastor or sometimes a teacher's child. It's not that common for a tradesman or a farmer's child to become a pastor, right? The pastors, especially the St. Louis trained pastors, are a kind of a caste in the church body. And so let's say you have 75 kids in your school, maybe, and the pastor has 4 of those kids, maybe 1 or 2 of the boys is going to go be a pastor. But yeah, so it's a pretty low number in the whole scheme of things. Yeah. Any other questions right now? Yeah, go ahead.
So you talked about the 2 seminaries.
Yeah.
So what was the expectation, or what happened commonly for the women? They didn't attend like a high school or
Yeah.
whatever was considered high school / college.
Okay, so that's interesting. So if you guys have like a local museum or something and you have old high school graduation pictures, you might actually find that most high school graduates in a local, especially like a farming area or something, most of them probably are women. Because they're the ones who are not inheriting the farm or some kind of craft right away. So they're going to go to high school and then maybe go into secretarial work or maybe go to a normal school or something until marriage. So that's what's happening most often. And that's also, this is just a hypothesis. I think that's where the Missouri Synod people are most often exposed to public education first. Because we're not really providing high schools. Except Chicago has one fairly, but it's not that early. And that's an enormous city, right? So most places you don't have a Lutheran high school to go to.
Yeah, Lutheran Institute in Chicago wasn't until 1920s.
Yeah, there you go. Yep. Yes, sir.
I just have to throw out there that we had a member here years ago,
Yeah.
as long as it's gone. She told me, "Oh, I never read the Bible. I find it too confusing. I stick with my Bible history book." She pulled it out.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. So that's an interesting thing about what's supposed to happen during quiet time is that Lindemann, you can hear him with some frustration that the Lutherans don't read the Bible because 1872. So the more things change, the more they 1872. He says the students teach them first where to find things in the Bible, then teach them to read in increasingly larger portions, so then they can sit down and they can read, an entire letter or something at one go. They need to be familiar with the Bible. And you can hear him saying this because he knows they're not. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts for right now? Okay. So go ahead.
And tuition is not an expectation at
No.
this point.
No.
Because it's a school for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, tuition is not a thing. No. And even up to the seminary level, oftentimes, if you're in there, you stay there. Yeah.
So is that what, you were talking earlier about, we have all of these congregations in so few schools.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, like, the major thing here is this tuition issue? Like, do people stop hearing about the Lutheran education for the children because now there's a financial thing attached to it, or is there something else that triggers the public school is fine in my case?
Yeah, I think there's also, this goes back to what we were saying about love motivating sacrifice in the first hour, is that people rarely have the actual costs of things, either in dollar terms. So people think, for instance, and this is just the most absurd thing, but they still think it, that public school is free, right? I mean, that's not how this works, right? Like everything costs money, but not only in dollar terms, but also they never have spelled out, this is what he's going to end up knowing here versus this is what he's going to end up knowing here. Over here, this is actually valuable for eternity. Over here, this is valuable for getting into this college. Specific costs are, if costs are not spelled out, we shouldn't be surprised if people don't understand them and therefore make decisions heedless of those costs. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Yeah. Just a little bit more about the curriculum. I think this is kind of fun. Bible history, catechism. With young kids, what he calls instruction and observation, which is kind of the beginning of natural history. So instruction and observation, and then later on it's going to be natural history explicitly, or what's actually called, and this is a completely different movement, but nature study, right? The nature study movement out of Cornell. They're doing that by starting out on taking the kids for walks and saying, how does the cow use the grass? You do that with the littlest kids because it's the most familiar object. So you always start with familiar and work to unfamiliar. And then, where does this bird nest? Or, what are those men doing up there in the church bell tower? Just get the child to look around him and to pay attention to what is occurring in the world. This will turn into natural history where you handle things both clinically in a classroom setting somehow, and then also experientially on nature walks and things like that. Okay, so natural history is involved. German and English are involved. In addition to German and English, German history and American history. Okay, so they do have an overlap with many of our classical curricula from today because they do the ancient, sort of the Bible lands, the history of the Bible lands. They do Greece, they do Rome. They don't really say much about the Middle Ages, seemingly, but they wouldn't be the first. And then they do, because they jump from Rome to Germany. And so their knowledge of the Middle Ages is entirely of Germany. And then that takes them all the way up to the present in Germany, and then they learn American history. And they don't really have their own books for that. So that's one of the few sections in Lindemann where there are no CPH books to recommend. Something they do see, and this is a point of commonality between what I'm saying is a historical model and what we're doing classically, is that they are trying to convey a certain set of cultural knowledge through the church. Now in this case, it is the preservation of the culture of their parents and grandparents. Okay? So this involves a wide variety of things. They retain, obviously, use of the German language, but also German titles for things. So the teacher, for example, is not called Mr., he's called Mr. Teacher, last name, fully in German. So this phrase, Herr Pastor, which in the modern Missouri Synod indicates like a certain attitude that a pastor has, that he just thinks he's in charge of everything. Or so Americans that don't know, they say Herr Pastor. He's being like a Herr Pastor. That's just a German title, and so the teacher has it too, Herr Lehrer, so and so, and they're conveying a certain amount of cultural knowledge. We're not conveying the same cultural knowledge, but we are conveying cultural knowledge through classical schooling. That is, classical schooling is not only a method or even the use of the Latin language, it is also a conveying of the history, the literature, the philosophy of Western civilization, which is let's say a little more specifically, Europe's inheritance of simultaneously antiquity and Christianity, right? That's Western civilization, right? Europe's inheritance of antiquity and Christianity. So we're not teaching specifically, we could have a classical school without teaching American history if we wanted to. I wouldn't recommend that in the United States, but we could do that, right? We could have a classical school without teaching nature study. Well, I wouldn't recommend that. The children live in God's world, but we could do that, right? They are doing the same work. They're simply conveying a different culture in trying to preserve their German culture. Now, what that means, and for a specific congregation where oftentimes the people in the church came from one or two places in Germany, and the pastor is highly educated and speaks a very standard kind of a German. So this would be like saying, we're preserving American culture, but I'm at a rural church in Texas, and I have a thick Brooklyn accent. What exactly does American culture mean on that level? I guess it means we all read Moby Dick together or something. But so it's very general, but it does have to do with literature and language and history, and that's all being conveyed through the media of German or English. Okay, the English definitely getting the short end of the stick. Okay, and then our last kind of big area, besides your basic skills, reading, writing, is going to be mathematics. The mathematics seems to be confined almost entirely to arithmetic at very high levels. Okay, so I love this book, How to Calculate Quickly. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's just a great book. It teaches how to do mental math with large amounts of numbers in large quantities. But those kinds of things, they don't seem to be teaching algebra or Euclid or anything like that. Not that I have found. Arithmetic is obviously the most practical branch of math, and so if we're only going up to 8th grade, and I don't want him to get cheated when he's selling his crops or selling his handiwork or something, arithmetic is far and away the most useful thing to teach for sure. So certain elements of these Lutheran schools are extremely practical in what they're teaching. They really are. They're not oriented like this is going to help you get the best job ever, but if we can help you get the best job, or at least not get cheated in business constantly, that would be good. Okay. I'm going to contrast that with classical schooling to some degree. Questions or anything before we kind of move on? You want to know what kind of chairs they sat in? I don't necessarily know that, but those sorts of kind of small things before we go on. Anybody? Yeah?
What would music curriculum look like?
They learned to sing. This is one of the places where they're most integrated with the life of the parish, and that actually happens in the person of the teacher, because as you probably know, all the teachers are required to know the organ. I mean, so the organist and the teacher are usually the same person, at least predominantly. Yeah. Is organ, and I think violin is optional, but organ is mandatory at River Forest and Seward. Yeah. So he's going to have some rudimentary choral direction for them. That's what they're going to learn, and the use of the hymn book is going to be pretty constant. And as you know, I mean, the number of just tunes is a lot lower, especially in the German language era. So if I know 30 tunes, I can sing pretty much anything. Yeah. Yep. Good question. Any other questions on this? Yes, ma'am.
Is there mention of like physical activity and like outdoor? I mean, you talked about taking nature walks.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're looking at reading, writing, and arithmetic, the basics.
Mm-hmm.
Music.
Yeah.
Do we have built-in physical activities? Do we have
No.
built-in?
And one of the ironies here is that the German gymnasium, which is, I mean, we have the word gymnasium, doesn't mean the same thing, but that's their high-level classical high school model, right? Is that the Missouri Synod takes the curriculum from the German gymnasium system, but even with our schools for pastors, our classical schools, we don't take the physical education portion that often We're just not, you know, and I guess with the farm kids, they're not worried about that. I don't know, but there isn't an extent, all sports are extracurriculars. So, and I don't think that's that abnormal, certainly in the 19th century, but it's ironic that even coming from the culture with the most highly developed physical education program, the Missouri Synod doesn't take that over. Part of that, too, is that the people that are most into gymnastics and bodybuilding, the Turners, are sort of like a lodge, and those are the secular Germans, right? So in a very German town like St. Louis, or you're going to have the Turners, and those are not the same people that go to church. So there's a kind of a cultural thing there. It would be like, yeah, it would be like finding like a really great lacrosse team in the Midwest. Like it doesn't. I miss lacrosse. So some people might not even know what that is. That's fine. Exactly, right? Yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But it's very culturally separate. Yeah. Any other questions while we're here? Okay. So,
I was just
yes,
saying,
sir. Yeah.
On the new podcast for the classicals in college in Wyoming,
Yeah.
they mentioned the seal of Concordia, Wisconsin.
Uh-huh.
And it's got the Bible open, and Homer, Cicero, Shakespeare, and of course Goethe. Right?
Yeah.
So there's this kind of, we have this German thing still that
Right.
is underlying here.
That's right.
Important to us.
That's right. Yeah, and I would say this is just a remark of mine, that's all, is that for a modern foreign language in a Lutheran school should probably be German.
Amen.
And the reason I say that, I mean, I like French better. Maybe if you're going into medicine or something, Spanish is more practical, but there is so much of our own theological and educational heritage in German. It would be sort of sad if you had a Lutheran school and no one ever learned any German, just because there's so much in the language, you know. So that's just a thought I have. Let me contrast what's going on with that kind of traditional or historical scope of Lutheran schools with what we're doing when we say classical education, which is what I do in our homeschool. My kids attended a classical school in Pennsylvania when I was there in my first call. You guys have a classical school. Is that the vision of actually giving, let's say, your average person a classical education is kind of new, right? It's kind of new because the extent of classical education, either in the broader American culture, we mentioned this in the context of the 19th century, or certainly in our own church body, was pretty small, right? So the difference here is that if everyone comes into the school, everyone can learn about, say, something about the history of Rome. But the curriculum that I'm teaching to all of my kids, you know, most of whom just, if more than one boy and then all the girls don't become pastors, that's most of my kids. 7 kids, 4 boys, 3 girls, you know. So if I have 4 non-pastors in the family, 3 girls and even one of the boys, they're learning the same kinds of things that only some of the pastors in the Missouri Synod were taught in 1870 or 1930, okay? Because they're learning Latin alongside the Roman history, and that's one of the big kind of benchmarks of what we teach in our homeschool. So that's a fairly new thing. That also means that what we are passing on, and I mentioned this before, what we're passing on is something distinct, and I think in its own way, maybe more interesting or intellectually ambitious than what we used to pass on. So what we used to pass on would be a knowledge of the German language. Maybe you would memorize some poems in German. Maybe you would have read something by the time you get out of 8th grade. Okay, but you're not, I mean, you're not reading long German novels and analyzing them extensively and saying how they relate to Baroque culture or something. I mean, it's not, you know, this is, okay. What we're doing now, I think, is much more intellectually ambitious, because we are asking children to appropriate not just the language that probably they speak at home, English, but we're asking them to appropriate and to appreciate and then to, in some measure, pass on things characteristic of a much broader group of people, denizens of the West, right? Inhabitants of Christendom, okay? And to understand something about that synthesis of classical antiquity and Christianity, okay? And I think that's wonderful. I mean, I believe that what we are doing is in that way educationally superior to what we were doing 100 years ago, except for some of the pastors. And I think that everyday people are perfectly capable of understanding those things. Do we all have to articulate it at the same level, or about Charles Martel, or tell me about, you know, Cato and his relationship to the Roman Republic? It doesn't. No, we don't need that. But a sense that the civilization that produced them is worth preserving and extending. Yes, we do need that. And part of the reason that we need that is that we are, unfortunately, like I said earlier in the morning about teaching Latin, we are unfortunately now weird. Whereas in 1872, if your average Lutheran school kid is learning, you know, reading, writing, and arithmetic and stuff like that, and his pastor has learned these things, those things are not necessarily under assault or perhaps vanishing in their lifetime. So let's say the basic idea, familiar, certainly since the Christianization of Europe, that the unborn are innocent and therefore should not be killed. A very commonplace idea, okay? Logically simple. We teach logic. Who else teaches logic? I don't know. Not enough schools, okay? So it's logically simple. It's historically attested, okay? We could prove that. We could talk about innocence and guilt. We could teach the kids to find in the Bible where punishment is only given to those who have committed crimes in the law of God. We have lots of sources for substantiating the very basic and civically extremely beneficial fact that the unborn are innocent of guilt and therefore should not be murdered in the womb. Okay? The kids that are in our schools now were born long after that was legally justified in the United States, and not understood as a basic contradiction of lots of other things, also on the books, constitutional, statutory, and otherwise, in the United States. If our children are some of the people that actually understand logic and the US Constitution and how those things are grounded in both the Roman Republic in the case of our Constitution, or logic being grounded in the nature of reality as God has made it, then that's wonderful, right? So I think that the way that we now teach is kind of different. But not so much in how we maybe get the kids to be quiet or figure out what's wrong with somebody, but especially the content of what we're teaching. The scope has changed radically, but the reason it's changed radically, and the reason that especially classical homeschooling, schooling is growing as it is, okay, and has the excitement especially of younger teachers, is because there is a certain urgency to what we are teaching that was not present for our forefathers, okay? And not only in the specific Bible history and catechism things. I think the urgency was always there. I think you see it in what they sacrificed to make these schools possible. It's in everything else along with that that the urgency is, I think, new, because they did not sense, certainly with the same keenness that we do, that the world was falling apart in front of their eyes, and that basic things such as logic or the definitions of justice or mercy or woman, right, were in danger of just disappearing altogether, right? So our scope has changed, and it's changed with other Christians, especially. So in the 19th century, the commonalities between the Missouri Synod and other church bodies and how they do school are going to consist in, it's a one-room school. They're not going to consist so much in content. Because the Missouri Synod is uniquely devoted both to confessional Lutheranism and to the preservation of German culture, and those are both relative rarities in 19th century America. We're devoted to confessional Lutheranism and the preservation of Western civilization, and that latter thing we actually have in common with lots of people. Okay, so this is also why cross-pollination, books, workbooks, all sorts of things we can share in common in a way that they were at that time really producing everything for themselves. They even produced their own sort of like German readers, which you would think they could have found anywhere, but they in fact did not and did not want to. So we have a lot more commonality with, Baptists who are doing classical education and Catholics who are doing classical education than they did, because the thing that they're trying to convey along with the confessional Lutheranism was a lot more distinctive, okay, weird as we are, it was a lot more distinctive than what we're doing. Okay. Thoughts on that before we kind of wrap up for this hour? Anybody? Questions? Good? Okay. All right. So let me wrap up just real briefly, and then we'll take a little break and get into methods after this. To kind of bridge us to what we'll do in the last session. The methods are going to be related to the scope, because the most basic thing they're going to try to do is to conserve energy. So we've mentioned energy maybe in every session, especially the teacher's energy. And so what they're going to do methodologically is try to conserve energy to cover the most scope at any given point in the school day that they possibly can. Okay, so that's where we're going to start when we get into the next session, because the methods are going to be attuned to, if possible, covering the entire scope. I could talk about the curriculum stuff all day because I find it fascinating, so if you want to discuss that a little bit more, we'll leave some time at the end of the last session to get started on Q&A. So can we take a 10-minute break and come back at 1:15, and then we'll get started? All right, that sounds good.
Well, I was talking about, when you had mentioned doing the Old Testament, the Bible history.
Yeah.
They included a lot of the Old Testament.
Yes.
As it relates to Christ. Because going to Lutheran school, we did not learn that.
Did you learn Old Testament?
Yeah, we had.
Yes, until we came to St.
There was no
Paul's,
connection
we had never heard
between
that.
the two.
So how did they teach it, or how did you?
It was Bible history.
Just happened. It really
There was
happened.
no correlation.
It really happened. I think that's
Yeah.
But we didn't, but there was,
It wasn't.
I learned, before coming here, my brother left Jordan East, went to Orthodox.
Okay.
And he gave me an Orthodox New Testament.
Uh-huh.
And all the footnotes, all related back to Old Testament.
Uh-huh.
The Old Testament.
Yeah.
It was like,
Yeah.
that was the first time I had ever made those connections. Ever. So that's what
Yeah.
when you said that, you said that too.
Yeah.
We didn't grow up in the living world having those things connected.
Right. And I think that is there are at least two different reasons for that deficit, which I think is really, it's very unfortunate. It also if you don't understand the Old Testament, of course you're not going to read the Bible. And if you do read the Bible, you're going to read the New Testament, and it's not going to make nearly as much sense as it should because you don't know the Old Testament. One reason that's happening is because historically we're not even reading, let alone preaching on the Old Testament. So there's not a lot, if the Old Testament's being taught in the Lutheran school, we often think of the disconnect as going in the other direction, but let's say it's being taught in Lutheran, so you learned about Ruth and Boaz on Thursday. You're not going to hear anything about that on Sunday because it's not even read. Okay? Historically, you get an epistle, which will talk about the Old Testament, and a gospel, which might be an echo of something in the Old Testament, but you don't know any. The other reason for it is that you can see that, like just the Bible History References book, is generally stuffed with factual information, right? So, which is really helpful at a certain level, right? So I think, like, I don't need my my 10-year-old, that's Lydia, she's with us. Lydia doesn't need to understand how the days of creation in Genesis 1 and 2 relate to the mention of specific days or the 8th day in the Gospels. She doesn't need to know that. She can memorize the sequence of when things are created, right? Like when is light, when are the heavenly bodies, etc. That's great. But I think that the instruction often stopped there. And so the Old Testament, if they know anything about it, is a series of stories that occurred but have no particular theological meaning or weight. So at that point, it's just kind of an ancient history textbook. You know, I might as well just say, you need to know this, and then read Ancient Men of Rome, and then, you know, these kinds of, like, it's the same, that's the same thing that's what I do with Roman history. What happened? That's what I ask her. I'm not asking her, what did Jesus mean by letting the Gracchi do what they did, you know, because Jesus didn't mean anything by that. But unfortunately, I think the Old Testament is treated in the same way. Just ancient history. Go ahead.
Well, I was trying to pay attention to it. The stories were that we knew the stories, and we knew that Jesus came from the Israelite people.
Yeah, right.
That was the purpose of the Old Testament, was to set up where Christ came from, his history,
Interesting.
His family.
Yeah.
That was the one connection between the two.
Okay. Yeah, which is something, but there are so many others.
Well, yeah, they're obvious.
Right.
And that's also what inspires it. I use imagination in a good sense. Inspires
Right, yeah.
imagination for who to study more. To find once I started seeing those connections,
Right.
it was like I wanted to read it all over again.
Yes.
Because I missed so much.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
that's also the problem with some of the Sunday school material we had.
Yeah.
It was very packed, and everything was a lesson for how do you behave. Okay, everything was, this is how you are a good little Christian girl. Because, you know.
You didn't study very
They tried.
No, he's not a very nice pastor. But it was directed toward
Behaving.
specific behaving.
Yeah, that was there. Every lesson at the back would have kind of an application. Okay, what does this mean for you? Okay, whatever the Bible's Old Testament Bible story.
Mm-hmm.
There was always an app. I remember those because I did pay attention. And
Yeah.
that's how that was taught.
Yeah.
So it was more very law oriented, and you became a very law kind of oriented person.
That is fascinating because one of the things that Lindemann goes over is what is historically used in the Lutheran Church also for preaching, but it's called the fivefold use of the Bible, fivefold use of Scripture. So in 2 Timothy 3:16, there are 4 of those, and in Romans 15:4, there's another one. So you use the Bible to teach, to rebuke, okay, falsehood, to correct, to train, that's 2 Timothy 3, and then Romans 15 is to console. And that's the way that when he's talking about, okay, proper distinction of law and gospel, how do I apply the Bible to the children's lives? The method by which I apply the Bible, application does not mean this is why you're supposed to do X, necessarily. That would just be training in righteousness. There are 4 other uses of the Bible. and a single Bible text, let's say the death of Jesus is especially rich. Is the death of Jesus law or gospel? That's a silly question, right? I could apply it, however, to almost anything, right? That text needs to be applied in all those different ways so that the child understands how to apply the Bible to himself. And if he just thinks the Bible is a book that I read and it says some things about Jesus and mostly it talks about me and how I'm supposed to behave, then he has missed the point of the Bible. And then we miss the point of most of, as I said in the last session, most of the instructing we're doing in a Lutheran school. Send him to the public school, it might hurt him less. Go ahead, yeah.
Would you unpack, I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you this anyway, the two, what is the distinction between correction and training in righteousness? How does he make those be different things?
Correction, the Greek word has to do with walking. So correction has to do with the kind of thing that we would file under from our second session, discipline. So when you get angry at Bobby, you can't punch Bobby in the face. That's correction. Training in righteousness is before that, like, here's the good thing to do. So
Gotcha.
they're closely related, but and they do involve behavior and living because they involve movement. So when the Bible talks about walking or walking in a way or a way, that's a life thing. That's not just a cognitive thing. Yeah. Yep. Other things on that fivefold use, but yeah, I think the misinterpretation of Scripture. It's a lot to have somebody under your spiritual care during the school day, or as their parent, or as their pastor, and so you have to learn to handle the Word of God well. When Lindemann is talking about study, he's generally talking about not just the teacher prepares for this lesson in math or this lesson in reading, but especially Bible study. Justin, did you have a question?
Yes.
Go ahead.
How about between rebuke and correction?
Rebuke is about specific falsehoods. Okay, so rebuke or refutation is another word that is used, translated there from 2 Timothy 3:16. Involves that I don't only teach what is correct. That's teaching. That's the first use, and that's for preaching and for teaching. That's the primary use. Okay. That's partly why their sermons were much longer, is because they're doing a lot of things in sermons that we think should only happen in Bible study. Right? So that division doesn't exist at that time. So teaching is one, here's what's positively true. Refutation or rebuke is here's what is false, right? And here's the difference between those two things. So obviously your application is going to vary by age, right? So I don't teach a 3-year-old here's what the Baptists say about baptism. She has zero. Her questions involve snacks, so she doesn't have questions about Baptists, right? Yeah, that's going to vary. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you just say the 5 things one more time?
Yeah, the 5 are teaching, refutation or rebuke, correction, and then training, and specifically training in righteousness. And those you can see are kind of two pairs of opposites from 2 Timothy 3:16. The 5th one from Romans 15:4 is consolation. The scriptures were written that we might have hope. That we might have hope. Yeah. So by the patience and comfort of the Holy Scriptures, we might have hope, Paul says. So those are conjoined by the Lutherans in both preaching and teaching into the fivefold use of Scripture. So that's those are helpful ways of thinking about how are law and gospel actually given to somebody, right? Because training is not even in the same tone as refutation. And refutation is not in the same tone if it's urgent, or if I'm just kind of calmly teaching, well, here's the difference between the Presbyterian church and the Lutheran church. So of these are matters of application. And they don't think of application as like, you learn the Bible lesson, and then at the end of the Bible lesson, or the end of the sermon, you get the stuff you're actually interested in that's about you, which is the application. The interpretation and the application are constantly both there throughout the lesson or throughout the sermon. So that's a different method, you're right, than the way that we usually teach the Bible. Other questions about Bible before we go on? We're going to handle the other things in this session, sort of according to the subjects that we laid out in the scope in the last session. But other questions about the Bible, methods of teaching the Bible or learning the Bible. I said there's a little bit of memorization. They're memorizing Bible texts that usually are arranged catechetically. Okay, so they're not memorizing just sort of. The teacher opens up the Bible randomly and says, I kind of like 2nd Chronicles more than the average person. Memorize something from 2nd Chronicles. What's happening, and you can see this in the way that the catechism is set up, all that explanation portion in our catechisms, is that the Bible texts are arranged according to parts of the catechism. So I'm in the first article. So we're going to memorize something about the creation of the world. We're going to memorize a text about angels, okay, where it's kind of stored within that catechetical system of instruction. The teaching of the catechism, when I say that the catechism is memorized, I mean not just the 10 Commandments, the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the words instituting baptism, confession, the Lord's Supper. I mean the entire small catechism, but even more than that, over the course of Lutheran schooling, even the synodical explanation. So you say, question 149, that has a standard reference, that's what the child is memorizing. So, what is the nature of an angel? Or how did God make the world? Or the first question, at least in the 91, I don't know if they retained it in this new one, in the 91 version is, what is Christianity? Right? It is the life and salvation, right? Which is a marvelous answer. Life and salvation. Go ahead.
But memorizing those questions, like
Yeah.
the 149.
Yeah, right.
Is that more of the logic stage? I mean, we're not looking at our kindergartners.
Oh, that's interesting.
I mean, our kindergarten through 8th grade here does all the chief parts and
Yeah.
the mean and a Bible verse that goes with each one of those.
Yep.
But, I mean, those additional questions, you're looking at the next level, right?
Next level, yeah. Yeah, and this grammar, logic, rhetoric stage, the Dorothy Sayers framework for education, they don't have that causes them to probably require more memorization earlier in a more, I would say, a thing in which we have probably gotten better is the level of creativity that the teacher is putting into things. Because at a very early stage, they are required to memorize things that are probably pretty heavy. So I think they think relatively little about things going over the kids' heads. I think about this, I'm more familiar with the preaching tradition than with the teaching tradition in our church, but I'll read a sermon and I'll think, this was preached in a farm church in 1902. I think that the listeners understood plenty. If you read newspapers from 1902, they're better written than ours are. But I think they understood plenty, but did they quite understand why he was going on at such length about the evils of the Reformed? Maybe, but maybe not. So I think there was they thought relatively little about going over people's heads. If anything, I think sometimes we think too much about going over people's heads, and we don't challenge them, or we're kind of insulting their intelligence. I'm speaking more about adults than kids, but sometimes about kids too. But I think they didn't worry about that hardly at all, from what I can tell. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and like these extra 300 questions or whatever, I mean, I had to know them to get confirmed in 7th grade. So, I mean, yeah,
Yep.
Did I understand them all? I don't.
Yeah,
I thought
that's
I
a-
did at the time.
Right.
Looking back, I'm not sure I did. But,
Yeah.
But I don't know if I would have memorized them as a first or second grader.
Yeah.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's a different volume.
So that's very interesting because you also notice, especially in Lindemann, there is a total absence of things that are relatively common in English language education inside or outside of Lutheran schools. So like essays. Your capacity to express at length an idea and support it with a variety, not a big deal. Reading, recitation, questioning, copying things down, okay, maybe some oral discussion, not long, this is my, so you can see in the catechetical tradition, because I think ultimately the 13-year-old kid, 14-year-old kid, isn't going to understand it if I either do 300 questions that I'm storing in her memory, or I ask her to write an essay about what she thinks about her faith. I think long-term, the memorization is going to be much more valuable that at the time she didn't quite understand than the essay that she wrote when she was 13 about what her faith meant to her. Right? So as these things kind of change pedagogically, you can see a very different emphasis that they don't have, because your capacity to express things in your own words it's definitely underdeveloped, but for long-term purposes, I think overdeveloped memory and underdeveloped articulation can be fixed more easily in adulthood than the opposite, where I have a very underdeveloped memory for anything I learned in school and an overdeveloped capacity to tell people what I think. Anyway, you have your hand up, right? Yeah.
Is there any discussion in Lindemann of practices for memorization, like actual practical, like here's how you help a child memorize?
Yeah.
Like, or is it just simply you're writing it down and you keep writing it down?
They don't do much writing down relative to us. So most things are drilled, and this is what I do with paradigms with my kids. I just do verbal drills. They write some paradigms down sometimes when it comes up in a workbook, but it's mostly verbal drill, and I find that to be much more effective than writing for just ingraining it. And they're not doing much writing on things that they are drilling. And they'll drill, so they'll drill grammar, they'll drill catechism, they'll drill Bible texts, Bible verses. They'll also drill math, I think, obviously. And which they arrange the timetables as a pyramid. I don't know if you guys have ever, yeah, it's like a flowing pyramid. I don't know. It's weird. It's probably some German thing. I don't know. But it's the only place I've ever seen it. But yeah. So there's a lot of oral drill. Also, I think because if I have a bright 12-year-old, I can kind of set him off and have him drill these kids on this, while I instruct the less bright 12-year-olds on the thing that he already grasps. Right, so it also is a conservation of energy if I can do oral drill than if I require a lot of writing assignments. And obviously I don't want to sit there every night grading essays too. So I think part of that, it's not like they didn't know about essays. I think part of it is an energy conservation thing. Yeah. Yeah. Scott.
The philosophy of a Lutheran school is established in this 1872 book and reiterated in 1930 by Kaler.
Mm-hmm.
Nowadays, Lutheran schools look very different from the typical Lutheran school, that is.
Mm-hmm.
Looks very different from what has been described thus far today based on these two books. When did that changeover occur? And when did the philosophy of 1872 and 1930 kind of change the Missouri Synod so that we kind of look more like a public school with a little religion being taught here and there?
Right, it's a big answer. That's why I have an answer, but I'm trying to think about how to not say it in a...
The Synod bureaucrat answer is, that's a very complicated answer. Complicated issue.
Explicitly choosing a different life path, so so I will give you an answer.
When the German language was kind of approved among the Synod, and it was all English now, and Was that the change in
Yeah.
the post-World War II era?
Yeah. So it's not just a German thing, because some of the, like I said earlier, with just the grading and the senior college and stuff, we hang on to a lot of German remnants as long as we possibly can. And there's something that I admire a great deal about the vision that we had for junior college, senior college, seminary, where, just prior to Seminex, they're still, so this is the early 1970s, and we're requiring American-born students to buy a German language commentary for their New Testament class. I mean, that's pretty good, just educationally, right? Not to speak of the theology, but that's pretty impressive that we just expected people to know those things, because that's very rare in the United States, outside of maybe like boarding schools in New England, that we would expect that level of education. So how do we transition into the way that we look now, where it's sort of public school, but everything's kind of on a smaller scale, pedagogically fairly indistinguishable, and Bible and catechism are definitely have a smaller place in the curriculum. That involves not only the general mainstreaming that we all go through, okay? So Americanization in an age in which that was viable and like a definite target to move toward, which you can already see in the 20s and the 30s. Even if you just read Kaler's book, Kaler's familiarity with American history and literature is beyond people who grew up entirely in America today, even though he probably grows up in a German-speaking home. So there really was something to buy into, and we bought into it. That involves specifically pedagogically buying into what's essentially going to be the progressive model of education, originally promulgated in the United States by Columbia School of Education, right, the Teachers College. Originally a separate institution, eventually through, especially not only John Dewey's sort of force of personality, but also his capacity to get his graduates jobs, also at other schools of education, other normal schools, will eventually change what American education is oriented toward, that it's largely psychologically defined, that education is almost sort of like a subset of psychology. And so there's not even specific content that you have to convey. It's more like you're helping the child's maturation process. He definitely doesn't have a sinful nature. Your chief concern is not some sort of specifically theological concern about his salvation. So that will eventually become mainstreamed, and there are various figures that wittingly or unwittingly play a role in this. I would say, for example, P.E. Kretzmann is a very unwitting participant in this, because his capacity to integrate mainstream ideas and accept or reject them on the basis of their theological validity is not a capacity everybody has. If you have a system that's supposed to produce sort of an even product, it's sort of a better idea to just say, this is the way you do things, okay? Because not everyone has the gift of saying, yeah, that's no good, but that's okay, and that's sort of okay, but not that great, that evaluative capacity. So he brings in, for example, discussions of child psychology that have no relationship to a Christian understanding of what a child is. That he has a sinful nature, that he is or needs to be regenerated by holy baptism, okay? And so that integration, or that sense of what you're trying to achieve in a classroom or something, is going to be very different if you just say, well, here are these ideas that I learned when I was doing my graduate work at this school, and I can't really perceive the difference between that and a Lutheran understanding of what a child is, and so away we go, right? Then there would be systemic reasons for, this is why we need to have this number of sports programs, or this is why, you know what I mean? And that involves a kind of financial, institutional mainstreaming into the rest of American life that we felt no pressure to do before a certain time period, yeah. So I think there's both kind of educational aspects to how this happens, and then there's institutional things, and those happen to our seminaries, our colleges, the fact that we have a headquarters building. There's lots of that, and then this is reflected in our schools in the ways that you identified.
So Kurtzman kind of started unknowingly by adopting some of his other worldly kind of ideas.
Yeah.
And then because he started writing about it, then
Yeah.
now we look secular, so we might as well go to the secular world to get more ideas.
Yeah, and there is something to, and I've seen this in our educational literature, but I also see it in our theologians over time, is that they have this sort of, they go from a posture of, we're trying to preserve our own culture that we brought here, to a great anxiety to be accepted, and an implicit sense that if only we are doing something, it must be low value or low status. So you will eventually want to exchange specifically Lutheran things for things of higher value or higher social status. Yeah, so that's gonna affect all our institutions sooner or later. Yeah, yep. Other questions about a Bible catechism? So let me talk a little bit about how they taught language. I've mentioned math already. I don't have a great deal more to say about that. It is a lot of repetition aloud. It's also a lot of mental problem solving, okay? So this conserves books, this conserves paper. A lot of things are on a shoestring budget. It's also, for the time and place, up to maybe mid-20th century, it's the most practical way that people are doing math. They're doing it in their head for everyday purposes. So orality predominates over writing in many of these subjects. Okay. Language is obviously a little bit of a difference. And you can find the textbooks for August Krull, who does a lot of hymn translation. In fact, he's sort of the father of our first English language hymnal. August Krull produces a German textbook, and this is because, as I mentioned earlier, the kids are not speaking standard. So it's sort of like the problem that we would have in correcting slang or pronunciation, or the reason you have to put a G on the end of this word is that even though your parents never say this G, it's actually in the word, kind of a thing. So you are indeed running, not just running. So there's that, right? So it's going to standardize their expression of even the language that they speak every day. The English instruction is very practical. It's almost business oriented, because along with it is not specifically being conveyed the same density of cultural information that's devoted to German. So methodologically, what they will generally do is combine subjects whenever possible. So let's do something that is sort of a copying assignment, but it's a copying assignment of something that I want you to memorize that is a German poem, that is something about German history. So I'm hitting a number of different things at the same time. That's smart, even if the only thing that you teach on any day would be German, right? That's just sort of an intelligent way to do instruction, because what you're getting is a fair copy of something that's now ingrained, because they had to write it out, I don't know, twice, of something that you know is valuable, that also discusses an actual historical event within a timeline that maybe you've discussed elsewhere or have begun to memorize somehow, or maybe have displayed in the classroom in some fashion. Okay. So they will methodologically, especially in things that are skills, not necessarily separate subjects, but writing, reading aloud, etc., they will generally combine that with some other subject. So maybe my copying assignment is a certain number of things about ants. Okay. There's this really cool little book, again, unfortunately only in German, but written by a pastor, I think intended for Lutheran schools, called The Beauty of God in Nature. And there's maybe 40 little lessons in there, and there's one about ants, and there's one about there's one about the stars, and there's one about oak trees, and so on. And so those are exactly the kind of thing that could be read aloud. You stop on the most significant sentence, you read it as they copy it out, then they copy it out 2 more times, and then maybe you move on. I mean, it's up to your imagination, right? And if you want to turn it into a story or something, but they're going to combine skills as much as possible with subjects, and even combine subjects as much as possible, such that the reading assignment is actually about history. Okay? So there's much less of a, I think this creates, and I think this is wise, especially because what we're doing in classical education is we are conveying really the entirety of antiquity's memory passed down. So history and literature and politics and even science are sometimes just sitting right next to each other in the same historical figure. As we do that, we don't have to fragment the student's knowledge, right? In the same sense that, in school when I learned about Ben Franklin, and you learn a fair amount about Ben Franklin if you grew up in Pennsylvania, because we only have one president and he wasn't that great, and apparently he helped get the Civil War started, so we don't have, there's no signs all over Pennsylvania about Buchanan the way you have anywhere. You might not even have known that it was James Buchanan until I said that, right? He's that obscure, but so we've got Ben Franklin, right? So we learn Ben Franklin as he's one of the founding fathers. We learn Ben Franklin as he's kind of an exemplary colonial figure. You could use it to teach American geography. You could say, well, Ben Franklin grew up here, but then he came down to Philadelphia. Why did he go there? That was the biggest city in the Western Hemisphere. What did he do once he got there? And then we would always take field trips. We were 2 hours away from Philadelphia, and so on. So just that single figure, and I haven't even mentioned lightning or anything else. And then in Philadelphia, you have the Franklin Institute, which is a whole science museum, okay, with his name over top of it. So you can use, especially when you're teaching people, because the people themselves are not fragmented. The students don't learn knowledge as a set of compartmentalized, well, I like math, but I'm not good at, or whatever. They're learning things as a coherent whole, right? Knowledge about God and the world he has made and his creatures within it, and how he has, in the case of math or science, how he has arranged the world to be discovered, right? So there is, and this is not, I hope, a distinction between our classical Lutheran schools and kind of historical Lutheran schooling, is that we learn about the world holistically rather than as a set of separate subjects. If you're in a graded school, which is basically everybody now, and especially in a school that's divided by subject matter, right? So I had somebody different in high school. I took French and German in high school, and then those were 2 different people, and then English was another different person, and if I had gone to a bigger school, it might have even been different departments. There is a tendency to fragmentation just by virtue of what you're concentrating on teaching about. So you know everything about the difference between the French they speak in Canada and the French they speak in France, and nothing about how Germans think about France. I don't know, right? Maybe the person that teaches German knows that. And the math person is outstanding at calculus, but could care less about foreign language. There is a lot being asked of a teacher who is being asked to teach holistically, okay? But I think ultimately, it's not only a lot more rewarding for the teacher, because you get to retain a general curiosity about the world, which is why, that's why I love homeschooling, because I learn something every day, you get to retain a general curiosity about the world that when things are fragmented, you don't get to so much. You don't get to so much because you have your discipline, you have your way of teaching it, and then you sort of move on. So what I think that also creates in the student is a sense that knowledge and wisdom are connected. And that connectedness, I think, is one of just purely in terms of learning, not even in terms of religion or any other specific subject, purely in terms of learning, that is one of the greatest gifts I think you can convey. not that you know everything about a specific subject, you are the authority on calculus or French, but that you can convey to them a sense that knowledge and wisdom are desirable and connected, because that's sort of the secret to their desire to continue finding these things after they're out of your care. If they think that, then they will want to pursue things on their own. If they don't, then when they're done with school, they're also, at least implicitly, that they're done with learning. Yeah. Any questions so far before we kind of wrap up here? Yeah, go ahead.
So, my grandfather was born in 24.
Uh-huh.
And so, you know, his school day was about the same as ours, but we have 100 more years of science and 100 more years of history to have to cover. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like our teachers today have more that our students need to know more than they needed to know 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Just in science and history alone. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So I think the question of much, what is meant by much, not many, right? Multum non multa is essential here, because I think the major art of teaching is selection and arrangement, not so much like how much I give you, but what do I give you and how do I choose to serve it? And that means that I say, okay, so for instance, here's like a really big difference. If you can go into like a used bookstore and you find a history textbook from 1950, or let's say you find one from 1910 or something. Something I notice is that older books give a lot more attention to geography and military history and teaching history than the way I was taught history in public school in the 90s. Okay, so I wasn't taught nearly as much geography, and I wasn't taught that, you know, if an army decides to do something, that's the end of this story, and that's the beginning, you know. You know, I wasn't taught that I learned that military history was kind of basic and primary from my dad, who was in the military. You know, and I think that, you know, ultimately he was right, that it doesn't matter that the pioneers went across the prairie in these specific kind of wagons if the U.S. cavalry isn't there too. And that if I know the one and not the other, I've missed a big part of the story. So I think this has to do with selection, and that selection has to do with, I mean, I have 100 more years of something, so if I'm going to work on that at all, and I think I should, I think you're right, I think I should say something about what has happened since 1924, then I have to pick what to leave out, and that's the whole art of the thing. But I think it was in 1924 as well. And so something that I have very little investment in is inculcating a certain sense that 19th century German culture is maybe like the apex of human achievement. But in the past, that was selected extensively for instruction in history and literature. But I don't need to teach my kids that they're Germans. You know, we've been here since the 1630s, so you know, that's not where I'm at, you know. And so I think it's all about selection and arrangement. So like with science, for example, if I'm going to teach science as a story, which I'm not, because there's just too much. Do I go back to Archimedes? Like, what do I do? You know, I think I'm gonna intersperse, and we're doing this, like we're doing astronomy right now. They know a little, we've mentioned the Babylonians. And if one of the kids picked up on, well, we read this chapter in the Bible and the Babylonians were mentioned, that's great, but it's not a big deal, because the chief thing I'm trying to convey is like, there are constellations, this, you know, there are signs and seasons, the heavens have a certain arrangement. That's the main thing, you know. So I'm teaching observation and technique and some memory things in astronomy. The rest of it, if they pick up on it, great. If they don't. But yeah, I think it's all selection and arrangement. Yeah. Other questions? We've got a few minutes left, so anything on your mind? End of the day? Yeah, you're tired. I'm tired too. All right. So let me wrap up in this way, and then I'll certainly thank you for your time and your attention. One thing I hope is that these resources are kind of brought forward to us more, so that we actually know where we came from, how we got here, both because it's simply useful and because it's interesting, but especially because I find that when I go into the past, it's a foreign country and it has all the benefits that travel has. Right? So I rethink, does this have to be this way? Do I have to teach it this way? Do I have to think this is important? Or conversely, yeah, this is why I don't teach the, tons of German history to my kids, specifically or something. But I mean, I have learned things that I've integrated into my own teaching, both of my children and at the seminary, from studying these things, because I saw, for example, that holism that they had to have, because they have one room and however many kids and one teacher. I saw that and learned from that in a way that I wouldn't otherwise have done. So I think learning from the past has all the benefits and some of the discomfort that travel does. Right? You see things very differently, and then you can't see them quite the way you did before you left home. Right? So I would love for this stuff to be available in some measure to us now, even though I don't think we're engaged in the same enterprise, as I made clear. We're not doing exactly what they did, and that's fine. It's actually better. Okay, in many ways, it's actually better. In addition to that, I want to encourage you, just because your school its continued existence is amazing. There's a lot of love and sacrifice and history there, and that's something both to be honored and to be appreciated. So I want you to know that, and not to take it lightly, and I'm sure you don't, but it's kind of remarkable and wonderful to see. And the last thing is this, that I think that thinking about these things is not an index of, oh, everything's getting worse. That's not really the purpose of knowing about the past, even if something has gotten worse, right? Just look at a baptismal certificate from back then and you'll realize nobody can write that well anymore. Right? They were just better at that than we are. But maybe our kids will be better because my kids practice more cursive than I did. So I can read my notes, however, so that's good. But you study the past, I think, also in order to build for the future, right? So you learn about it, you compare it, you're changed by it, and it actually helps you move into the future better because you have the wisdom of more generations with you. You're not kind of flying blind. There are a lot of similarities. Kids are still super energetic. You have to match that in some measure. You have to deal with how different they are. They're still simultaneously sinful and regenerate, okay? And you're trying to train both of those things in the proper directions. Some things haven't changed at all, and that's encouraging. What's also encouraging is that they built out of many fewer resources than we have. So they had to pick what things they needed to write and to print or to acquire from somewhere else, and they had to go to much greater lengths than we do, even with supply chain shortages, to get those things that they needed. Okay, so we have been given enormous amounts of gifts to use. Okay, also here, it's usually not a gift, but also here including the internet. Because one way that I figured out that Lindemann wasn't as unusual as maybe you might think he was is I found the first sort of normal school textbook similar to his, written by a guy named Samuel Hall in New England, called Lectures on School Keeping, that tells you how to run like a one-room schoolhouse. And it's from maybe 30 or 40 years before Lindemann. And a lot of the recommendations are the same because kids are the same, and the curriculum was largely the same, just not in German. So lots of very interesting things, all available to us. So I would also say this, that we have been given enormous amounts of gifts. To whom much is given, much is also required, right? So there's both an encouragement here to you, but also a challenge that you not be stale or stagnant or complacent, because it's always better and more fun if you yourself are growing as a teacher. And it's better for the kids, and it's better ultimately for the school and the congregation if you are pushing yourself and growing and learning and renewing your own ways of doing things and thinking and explaining and all of the rest of it. And you have way more gifts than they did, really at your fingertips, accessible to you, than they ever did, okay? So they did a lot with a lot less, so imagine what we could do with a lot more. Thanks for your time, thanks for having me.
Thank you everyone for coming out. I want to thank Dr. Koontz again for his fantastic presentation and his time. Hope you go learn some things. I think that's all I got. Is there something else I'm supposed to say while I'm up here, Pastor?
No.
Stage left. Thank you.